I'd like to call the meeting of the Urbana City Council to order. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Ammons?
Here.
Mr. Brown?
Here.
Mr. Jacobson?
Here.
Mr. Madigan?
Here.
Ms. Marlin?
Here.
Mr. Roberts?
Here.
Mr. Smythe?
Here.
Mayor Pressing.
Here. The first item is the approval of the minutes of the previous meeting, January 19th, 2016.
I'll make the motion to approve.
Motion by Roberts.
Second.
Seconded by Jacobson. Any additions or corrections? If not, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? That motion carries. Are there any additions to the agenda? See any? Okay, we have a lot of people who want to talk. We're moving to petitions and communications. First, Reverend Dr. Evelyn B. Underwood does not wish to speak, but she would like to put on the record that she's continually concerned about the Dr. Ellis subdivision sewer problems. Okay. Jonah Weisskopf. Would you like to come up and take a seat and talk into the microphone, please? And you have 5 minutes. You don't have to take 5 minutes, but
I won't, I promise.
okay.
To confirm, we're on the 611 West Elm.
This is public comment, and you can talk about whatever you want.
Okay.
So that's appropriate.
Yeah. I want to speak in opposition to the historical designation of 611 West Elm in Urbana. I just have some brief comments I'll read. I lived at 311 West Elm for 3 years. I own 7 rental properties in West Urbana. I'm on the Zoning Board of Appeals, and I'm on the MOR Design Review Board. I'm a residential and commercial broker with Keller Williams, and I'd call myself an expert on student rental housing, specifically in West Urbana. The big picture, I would implore council to start to try and see how the historical designation process is being used to prevent real estate development and new construction in greater West Urbana. I believe, like many times before, we are here on the precipice of preventing this 5-unit West Urbana development, not because of the history or historical greatness or historical significance of 611 West Elm, but because of the future of 611 West Elm. We are here because the landlord wants to invest over $500,000 to replace an old, ugly, unsafe student undergraduate rental with a brand new 5-unit, new construction, American with Disabilities Act compliant, fully sprinkled, fully code compliant, fully safe building. Kevin Hunsinger testified that he spent over $10,000 on this project before having it frozen and put in jeopardy by an 11th hour historical designation after the MOR Design Review Board approved the project. I don't think this is the way for a city to do business. The entire historical designation process should be called into question, in my opinion, and revamped. Council members, if we don't learn how to encourage healthy real estate development, and we don't learn how to encourage growth, then we will miss out on the chance to grow the city of Urbana. The 611 West Elm development will increase the assessable tax base of the city of Urbana and encourage young adult, entrepreneurial, millennial residential growth in and around the downtown Urbana area. This is a chance to add brand new, fully sprinkled 1 to 2 bedroom apartments a few blocks from downtown Urbana. This is an opportunity. When you look at the Elm Street corridor, it's all rentals for the most part. There's a couple families there, but really we're talking about almost 100% rental property in the entire 2 blocks stretching from Kohler to Cedar Street. There are a few families, but this is mostly undergraduate student rentals, 18 to 22-year-olds. Let's move away from housing 18 to 22-year-olds in unsafe 100-year-old structures and encourage the young adult entrepreneurial class that we know exists to come live a couple blocks from downtown Urbana. The city of Urbana must not miss this opportunity to grow a longer-term base of residents who can serve and be a part of the downtown community. The Hunsinger project will encourage a tenant base for young professionals, millennials, grad students, 100% code compliant, and ADA compliance. The project passed the MOR Design Review Board. It will raise the assessable tax base, and the apartments will be the safest apartments in West Urbana. The safest. Council members, I urge you to oppose the historical designation of 611 West Elm, and I urge you to review the unfair historical designation process that would allow a landlord to spend $10,000 before being stopped in his tracks. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Rich Cahill. I'm just doing it in the order that I received them. Okay?
Hello, I'm Richard Cahill. I live at 307 South Orchard in Urbana. I urge you to vote in favor of the historic landmark nomination. I was very active at the Ricker House, and back in '94 or so, that was scheduled for the same thing. It was going to be torn down, and luckily the Urbana Planning Commission voted 3-2 to say no to demolition. Otherwise, the Ricker House would be just a postcard. I really feel that when we were marketing the Ricker House for single family, if there had been a 5-story, 4-story apartment just to the north, we would have had a real hard time convincing people that that was a single family neighborhood and that it would be owner occupied since we sold the house in 2001. I wouldn't want to be in a Ricker House when you see 4 stories and you're living in a fishbowl, essentially. I live in a fishbowl on 307 South Orchard. Sometimes we can't even be in our own backyard because the kids are up on the 3rd floor looking down on us. So think about the economic impact on the Ricker House families. Thank you.
Thank you. Carolyn Baxley.
Carolyn Baxley, 510 West Main in Urbana. I hope that you got the copy of the ordinance that covers the MOR district, and I'm not implying that you haven't read it. I just thought it would be helpful to have it in front of you this evening. I was on the Plan Commission when the MOR district was drafted, and I can assure you that the project before you tonight, the proposed apartment building, is the very antithesis of the intent of the district. There was total agreement among the members of our commission that Green and Elm Streets needed to be protected from further encroachment of large, incompatible apartment buildings, and that it was very important to protect the look of the streets, and that they needed to be maintained by encouraging adaptive reuse and limiting infill development. Tonight, you're being asked to either designate or not a property that some people would not consider to be appropriate for landmark designation, but I would like to remind you that the ordinance, the Historic Preservation Ordinance, only requires that the property meet one criterion among the group, and the house meets that in spades. You've heard, well, if you've read the packet, you know that before the Historic Preservation Commission, there were testimony about the architectural significance of the house. Council needs to focus tonight on the purpose for which the MOR district was established, and not be misled or distracted by peripheral arguments that are in conflict with the city ordinance that states its purpose. I would like to read it for the record, and you have copies before you, and I would ask that you pay close attention to the underlined sections. Ordinance number 9091-59, section 4-2-H. The MOR Mixed Office Residential District is intended to provide areas for a limited variety of business, office, and residential land uses in proximity to low-density residential dwellings in order to promote the economic viability and preservation of older residential structures while protecting the aesthetic and residential character of the area. The development regulations and permitted uses make this district suitable for properties which may no longer be viable as strictly residential uses, but are located in a residential setting. This district is intended to encourage the adaptive reuse of these older residential structures as an incentive to preserve and extend the useful life of such structures, while also allowing compatible new development. The MOR district is also intended to promote the conservation of buildings and neighborhoods, which in combination or individually are of unique community and neighborhood significance. The land uses permitted and the development regulations required in the MOR district are intended to protect nearby residential uses by limiting the scale and intensity of the uses and buildings that may locate in this district. The MOR district is appropriate for mixed uses on small sites which need careful evaluation of use-to-use compatibility so that the stability and value of surrounding properties are best protected.
Ms. Baxter, you have 1 minute.
Yes. The words protect and preserve are used several times in this stated purpose, and its meaning is crystal clear. It is the job of city staff and ultimately your job to ensure that developments in Urbana are not in violation of our ordinances, as this proposed development clearly is. 611 is not a derelict property. It's a virtually intact example of the Dutch colonial revival style of architecture and an important property in the fabric of 600 block of West Elm Street, one of our oldest streets that was once home to many of our city's most prominent citizens. Your decision tonight is more than a thumbs up or thumbs down on landmarking a historic house. Council needs to send a clear message to your staff and to support your own ordinances. The proposed development should have been headed off at the pass before Kevin spent time and money on a project that is in clear violation of a city ordinance before you. I urge you tonight to vote in favor of designating 611 West Elm a local landmark and put in place an immediate moratorium on future development in this district until everyone is on the same page as to its intents and purposes.
Thank you very much. Laura Huth.
Good evening, Council, Mayor. My name is Laura Huth. I'm a former City Council member from Ward 5, and I am here tonight to reiterate some of the comments that I sent by email to this body. Pardon me. Since I was in the chamber last, I require these. I don't want to read my comments that I sent to you by email, but I do want to use them to paraphrase. I was on council as 12 years ago, so my council term spanned 8 years. That was many, many years ago, almost 2 decades ago. Back then was when we voted on the MOR district, and when we did, we saw that region, when we envisioned it, as an area targeted in which higher density mixed uses could and should help spring a corridor from campus to our downtown. It was a very purposeful decision by the body at that time, after long input and deliberation, to try to grow that region into something that was more strategic and less random. We were looking at some compatible redevelopment for that area. The project that is being proposed tonight for 611 West Elm, I believe, falls directly within the envisioned MOR district that we were talking about at that time. The 4-unit, 1-bedroom per unit project that is slated to take the place of the admittedly old, though arguably small H historic house, has been manipulated heavily over time. The home has fallen victim to several occupancy limitations that have been enacted since I was on council, which, given its size, has made it difficult for the owner to regulate. The proposed plan for this site is modest. It is a well-designed replacement that is highly suitable for the district that was envisioned all those years ago when I was on council. While it is sad that another old home in our community will be removed to make way for it, the home that is being slated for removal, while old and carrying a level of history, is not capital H historic. It certainly has some minor distinguishing architectural features, no doubt, but that hardly makes it suitable for landmark status. Urbana must be in a position of encouraging development, suitable development for our community. I don't need to tell anyone here, we have been hit so hard since I was on council, economic development-wise. We have seen very little interest in development in our city compared to our sister city. And while we need not sell out our values to encourage development, neither should we erect unnecessary and arbitrary roadblocks that drive needed development to our city. If renovated, the current structure that sits at 611 West Elm is estimated by an expert to cost $300,000. An appraisal, again by an expert, of the raw land there was determined to be $250,000. If it's landmark, the land value plummets to $140,000. What is being proposed for that land is housing of comparable density to what is there. With some modifications, it actually could be denser, but the developer has proposed exactly what is legally allowable on that lot, not asking the city for anything more. In many regards, visually, it is an improvement to the current structure. While moving forward with the plan represents important, no, I would argue critical, relationship and trust building with one developer who is willing to take a chance on our city, a chance we so desperately need right now. Let me be clear here, I support historic renovation. I support historic preservation. I live in historic East Urbana. I used to represent historic East Urbana. I myself live in a 100-year-old home that I have lovingly renovated, much to the point that it was showcased in a magazine. I totally get loving historic structures and working to preserve and protect them. That said, there is a big difference between small H historic and big H historic. The Ricker House that is next door to this property, that's capital H historic. 611 West Elm is not. This 611 West Elm might fit the label of small H historic, but it is not capital H historic. I would urge you tonight to recognize the history that 611 West Elm brings to our community, but it is not meant to be a landmark property. I believe that we should be moving forward with a new development for that property, and we should be preserving the intent of the MOR district that was enacted so long ago, and allow our city to move forward with economic development that we so badly need. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Kevin Hunziker?
Good evening. I'm Kevin Hunsinger. I'm president of Hunsinger Enterprises, a family business owned and operated here in Urbana for 37 years. I'm the reason everyone here tonight. I've had a history of building new structures. I've had a history of remodeling existing structures. And I came to the professional opinion that this building was one that needed to be removed to make provisions for new construction. Construction that our students and neighbors seek and want, one-bedroom apartments. In the 11th hour, this historic designation came about. And quite honestly, I don't think it's anything about historic designation. It's about lack of development. Wanting no development in West Urbana. The city staff recommended against the landmark status. A professional by the name of Gary Cole, who is in his credentials are in your packet, who has absolutely no political ties to this whole situation, who is a licensed attorney and a licensed architect in the areas of historic preservation, and who deals with historic preservation from the southern tips of Illinois to the lake shore of Chicago, does not believe that this is a historic landmark. The building was not listed anywhere else as being one of the 100 most historic buildings. I was given no indication it had historic value. It was not on Urbana's list. When we got to the 20th of January and the vote was taken, member Ms. Smith laid out a very clear understanding of the condition of the property and all of its shortcomings and all the reasons why it is not a historic structure. That list is in the minutes on page 5 and 6 of your packet. And she concluded that this is not a landmark. Mr. Dossett also voted against the landmark status because he believes the existing condition disqualifies its landmark status. Mr. Seiler, in my opinion, chose to ignore the ordinance, where he states the current condition, in its current condition, it can be a landmark if you throw enough money at it. You could recreate a porch, you could remove the fire escape, you could replace the doors with windows, you could create a new entry, you could install period-looking windows, and you would have a landmark. That, his words, page 6 of the minutes from the 20th.
You have 1 minute left.
I'm sorry?
I'll move for as
You-
much time as he needs. He's the property owner.
Second.
Thank you. Ms. Pagliolis argued that she loved her old house, and it was in as bad a condition as mine. But she spent a lot of money on her house fixing it up. She enjoys it. She enjoys the rubberneckers that drive by. If this was my personal house and I wanted to just spend my personal money like I do on my old antique tractors, I understand it. But it's not. It's my business. It's my livelihood. It's not the same thing. Mr. Metcalf voted the landmark status, but he said it only fell under criteria C. He stated you could not use the Virginia McAllister Field Guide to American Houses because its interpretation was too strict. And furthermore, the house by itself should not be what is considered in the landmark process, but the entire neighborhood. He stated he felt the only items altered was the porch. These remarks expose he simply was making up his own rules by ignoring a professional historical guide, choosing to use the criteria for historic district as opposed to a landmark, and failing to acknowledge the other lack of integrity that had just been noted by Ms. Smith. Ms. Novak, she's a historic activist. Her love, her profession is preservation. She could never vote against preservation in the face of development. I actually respect that position. But that doesn't mean that what she wants represents the will of the people and what is best for Urbana. This landmark status is truly a plea to stop development. There's a group of individuals who believe development of any type is unacceptable. Over the past 30 years, I have seen the downzoning of property from R5 to R2 in the 1990 downzoning. I've seen the MOR district created in the area where there was so much student housing that to zone it R2 would have been unmanageable. I have seen the creation of additional levels of bureaucracy, such as the systematic inspections, the rental registration, and various other acts to discourage developers to develop in Urbana. But I'm still here. When all else failed, the latest tactic has been to nominate properties for landmark status under the veil of historic preservation. 7 of the 16 landmark properties have been protested by the owners. The 2 previous applications were only submitted when the property improvement in West Urbana was made public. It was a reaction to owners of property wanting to improve and upgrade the Urbana area. 611 is the same way. I received approval from the city staff, from the MOR Review Board, and just days before, they nominate it. I want to make a couple things, clear up a couple things. This is not a 4-story building. It is a 3-story building. It is a total of 5 units, 4 one-bedrooms and a 2-bedroom. It is a total of about 4,500 square feet. That is about double what the existing structure is. But there would be no junky old garage, and its overall height is only about 10 feet higher than what exists. And the building will be no closer to the Ricker House than the existing structure. Representation of the people is a balancing act, right? You have a group of people you represent that want no development in Urbana. That's their right. They sometimes come here in mass to make it look like they represent all of Urbana. But I will tell you that is not true. Out here today, do you see all these people? There's a lot of concerned Urbana residents that believe that development and development done right is what's going to bring Urbana back. How many of you out there actually are here because you oppose it, whether you're going to speak or not? I wish you would raise your hand. How many of you are against it? The historic preservation, the nomination of preservation. It's a lot of people. You represent them just as much as you represent all of those who want it to be a landmark. If you choose to landmark this house, you are sending a signal that Urbana doesn't want development and is choosing to ignore a large segment of the people you represent. If you landmark, this will be yet another property that would have otherwise increased the real estate tax base. And honestly, you have no right to further complain about the poor tax base. If you landmark this house, you are actually ignoring your history. The influential people the Historic Preservation Commission talks about and hold high esteem as the movers and shakers of the period were not at City Hall demanding the surroundings should remain pastures, open prairie, and unchanged by human influence. They were progressive, innovative people who thought development created commerce, and commerce generated growth, and growth created prosperity for Urbana. Voting no to this landmark will be upholding the recommendation of your own staff. It will affirm the commandeering of one person's property for the will of another will not be taken lightly. And Urbana understands the need for additional tax revenue. Urbana supports individuals proactively improving housing choices for students in our community, and you will be reassuring the community you are not against development. I thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a lot of people who want to talk who have already submitted these cards, and because we have so many, I would like to limit the remarks to 3 minutes. If people want to have somebody else speak for them, that would be good, but we'd like to hear from everyone, but we don't want to stay here all night. We'd like to get to the business of the meeting. So it'll be 3 minutes. Gina Pagliuso, if I don't keep mispronouncing your name.
Close enough.
I'm getting closer, though, right?
You are.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Gina Peluso, and I live right up the street on Vine Street. And I am a member of the HPC, and I did vote to nominate to landmark this property. I'm not here to speak on behalf of the HPC. I'm here on my own behalf. And I just wanted to point out a couple of things. You know, obviously my views are out there. I voted to landmark this property. I believe that it has integrity, which is one of the 7 things that it can be nominated for. This house has integrity. And so I voted for the landmarking based on the integrity of the property. The HPC in the zoning ordinance, there are 6 different reasons to have the HPC: to provide a mechanism to identify and preserve the distinctive historic, architectural, or landscape characteristics of Urbana, fostering civic pride in the beauty and noble accomplishments of the past, stabilizing and improving the property value of Urbana's landmarks and historic areas, promoting restoration and rehabilitation by encouraging investment in historic resources, ensuring that all of the economic benefits resulting from preservation are available to our citizens, and preserving the character of our historic neighborhoods, and especially Urbana's historic downtown buildings and facades. So that's why we have the HPC. And I'm proud to sit on that board. I used to come here before I was on the HPC, and every time there was an HPC agenda on the item on the agenda, I would come and talk and say, please, let's landmark it. I told you a long time ago, I'm an old house freak, and I'm still an old house freak. And I'm glad to be on the HPC. Article 1 of the zoning ordinance, ordinance, there are 3 items out of 20, some odd, that say, 1, to conserve the value of land, building, and structures. Another one, to preserve the character of Urbana neighborhoods in a manner consistent with the other stated policies of the ordinance, with reasonable allowances for existing uses. Also,
You have
To
1
en-
minute.
thank you. To ensure and facilitate the preservation of sites, areas, and structures of historical, architectural, or aesthetic importance. I'm not here to stop any development. Anybody has the right to nominate a property, and they have 45 days from the date of demolition application to put that in. That's part of the ordinance. So whether it comes on day 44 or day 2, it makes no difference. Our ordinance allows that. There's a demolition delay ordinance in effect for a reason. So that, and it actually states it, so that historical integrity or historical nature of the property can be investigated, and if a landmark and so that a nomination can be put forward. You know, my main reason for being here is because I don't want this to be an adversarial process. We have ordinances in place. We have an ordinance that talks about the MRR. Thank you. Could I just get maybe 1 more minute? Thank you.
Yes.
We have ordinances for the MOR. The MOR says that we're supposed to ensure that we encourage the adaptive reuse of the buildings. It doesn't say of the land, it says of the buildings. We're not adaptively reusing this building. So I want us to be able to find a way where we're not at each other about this. I don't want to sit on a board where people think that I am there to make sure that they can't build anything ever again. We have ordinances in place for a reason, and I hope that we'll follow them. One more thing I wanted to point out is that in the rental registration program, the very first section under purpose says that we did this because we want to make sure that we are maintaining good, safe, sanitary conditions that do not create a nuisance or blighted conditions for any rental properties. This property has had no building permits taken out since Mr. Hunsinger has owned it. And if you look through your packet, Mr. Witzing, I believe, picture after picture after picture in his Exhibit H says that he's showing you the current condition with deferred maintenance. So, you know, again, I don't want to be adversarial about this. I want us to find a way where we can all be happy. I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. Matt Cho. Matt Cho is apparently not here. He is opposed to the historic landmarking. Phil Fizzella. Is Phil here? He's in favor. David Thies. I know David Thies is here.
No, I think Phil is here.
Oh, I'm sorry. You'll be next, David. Sorry about that.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd first off like to thank you for welcoming us to your meeting. I do appreciate your time, so I'll keep this brief. I'm Phil Fasella, and my wife and I are developers in Champaign. We also manage a couple dozen rental units over there. I must give my apologies to Mr. Hunsinger, but I've come tonight to lend my support to the Landmark Commission and the historical designation on 611 West Elm. As many of you are aware, development is a big business in Champaign. Major developments and minor developments have been a fantastic boost over the past 20 years to our tax base, and we greatly enjoy the fact that the majority of students at the University of Illinois attend classes in Urbana, but come home to our luxury apartments and spend hundreds of dollars a week at our restaurants and bars. Your anti-development policies have been a goldmine to those of us on the other side of Wright Street. It has greatly reduced the tax burden on our citizens, and as development continues to the north and west of campus, it continues to increase the value of our properties. If Urbana should change course and pursue her fair share of the tax base in this community, it would be to our great detriment. Mr. Hunsinger, I'm sorry for your misfortune, but I hope that you will see the light, sell this property, and join us in the redevelopment of Champaign. Thank you for your time.
And thank you. David Thies.
Good evening. My name is David Thies. I'm a lawyer with Weber and Thies in Urbana. Our offices are at 202 Lincoln Square across the way. And I'm here tonight as the attorney for the owner. Are we looking at something? Okay. Looked like you were pointing at something behind me. That's okay. Just want to make sure I was doing the right thing. I'm here as attorney for the owner of the property, Hunsinger Enterprises Incorporated, whom we have represented for about the entire time they've been doing work in Urbana. And specifically, and for the record, we are asking that you reject the request for landmark designation of this property. I want to make just a few points. First of all, this case is marginal at best. Our papers that are before you that were part of the materials submitted to the Landmark Historic Preservation Commission show that in great detail. I'll only mention a couple of things. One is that your own so-called list of 100 most eligible properties, and that's my term, I'm not sure exactly what it is, but, and I know it's not precisely 100, but it's basically the properties that have been looked at and evaluated and are viewed as most eligible for historic preservation. This property is not one of those properties. It's not one of the properties. What kind of a message do you give to the development community when you establish such a list and then this happens? 2 of the 6 people on your Historic Preservation Commission voted against the designation. And finally, the staff has recommended against it, arguing that the criteria of the ordinance have not a single one of them has been met. Now, when you have a marginal at best case, you really need to be concerned, as you always should be, and I know you are, but especially with a case like this, about the fairness of the process, the due process issues. We've raised them all in our papers. I'll just mention a few things that I want to call your attention to. First of all, there is the assertion by our experts that the ordinance itself
1 minute left.
is vague.
Move to extend.
Second.
The ordinance itself is vague. In particular, one example of that is that your ordinance uses the term integrity, the integrity of the building, the integrity of what is there on the site. There's no place in the ordinance where that term is defined, and the Commission looked at definitions that are found in the Federal Register, the federal regulations, as authoritative as to what the word integrity means. And integrity became a pretty important term that night at the Commission. I want to suggest that we didn't know that we were supposed to go to those extraneous documents to find the definition of the term. We tried to figure it out based on things like Webster's dictionary. And there's a common use, and I think we have a general understanding, but we didn't know exactly what that meant. That makes the ordinance vague. Finally, there's a procedural question that I wanted to raise on the question of due process, and that is that, and we made the point at the Commission, that it is improper for a member of the council to take a position in advance of seeing the evidence. You sit as a quasi-judicial body when you sit here as a city council, and Mr. Jacobson took a position in advance of the hearing, arguably to encourage the designation, and so our formal objection is that that vote should not be counted. Mr. Jacobson's vote should not be counted. His position was expressed in terms of an email January 6th to the Commission, arguing for the historic designation, for actually arguing against the demolition. And with respect, because Mr. Jacobson and I are good friends, I feel that it would be inappropriate to have him vote on this. I also believe that this does not lower your vote that is required. You have 7 people on your council, and the only reason that you lower that number is if you have declared a conflict of interest. This is not a conflict of interest. This is just that someone took a position in advance. I don't think that's proper, and we ask that Mr. Jacobson not be allowed to vote on this. Finally, I leave you with a general comment that living in Champaign as I do now, working in Urbana, having grown up here, perception is an interesting thing. I still think of myself, frankly, as an Urbana kid, and that became only very difficult when my Champaign Central student children went to the Central Urbana football game, and I found it impossible to root against my own high school, and they allowed me that I didn't have to do that. So you have a question of how you look at Mr. Hunsinger's business. I heard at the evidence presented at the Commission that this was kind of an outsider, has a lot of properties. Why, if he has so many properties in Urbana, does he have to worry about this one? Why is he worried about making money on this one? Well, that's one way of looking at Hunsinger Enterprises. Another way of looking at Hunsinger Enterprises is that this is a business that decided to stay here, decided to make their livelihood here, owns about 30 properties here, has earned awards from PACA. When offered the opportunity to develop and preserve, they do. And now, based on their professional judgment and the judgments of many professionals that we presented at the time of our hearing, this property just won't be economically viable as a commercial property. That's how I hope you look at Mr. Hunsinger, as your friend and your neighbor and your colleague, and one who cares about the tax base of Urbana and the housing stock in Urbana and the preservation of legitimately historic buildings, and this is not one of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Matt Cho is in the room. Would you like to speak? We've limited the speaking to 3 minutes because I have a lot of people who want to talk. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Matt Cho, and as a resident and business owner in Urbana, I would like to represent my opposition to this historic landmark recommendation. We live in a city that has a wealth of history, as evidenced by the list of top 100 historic houses compiled by city staff. I recognize that this is one of many factors that makes the fabric of our city unique, and if we were discussing one of those houses on that list today, then I think the conversation would be much different. And as someone that not only lives but invests in Urbana, I'm reminded how much the city has to offer residents, visitors, and even investors, simply by the positive response I get when people visit downtown and are surprised to find so much has changed. I think that we all recognize that our city is growing, and with that growth comes change, and I understand that why that change might be uncomfortable for some people. Honestly, I don't think this nomination this evening is about a historically significant house, but an example where we have a habit of using preservation as a tactic to prevent something that perhaps people are not comfortable with. The investment of Kevin Hunsinger and other property owners that I hope will invest their time and money to build safe, affordable, and modern spaces, whether to lease or live in themselves, is no different than what Norman Baxley or Carolyn Baxley does with Round Table House development or the developers on Campus Circle on University Avenue. And what I see happening tonight, I wonder, is that even right? Is it right that an individual can go through the development process with the city, get approved, and only to be stopped because of a last-minute landmark nomination? Furthermore, is this even what we should be using historic preservation for? Because when I think of historic preservation, shouldn't we be celebrating the historic assets of our city rather than reactively using it as a tool to prohibit development? Shouldn't developers or future residents be encouraged to choose Urbana because of our historic fabric, which makes this place a great place to live, rather than avoiding any investment because preservation is seen as too restrictive? And do we continue to support a commission that fails to recognize something as possibly historic when it is even too late?
You have 1 minute.
If Urbana prides itself as being innovative, progressive, and fair, then I'm afraid that hearings like this evening move our city farther away from that. For this reason, I ask that council not approve the landmark nomination, but more importantly, rethink what the purpose and practice of historic preservation is for our city. And as someone that came back to pursue architecture and urban planning, I know that I and probably many others would be willing to do the proactive work of making historic preservation an asset for our city and not the bad habit it has become tonight. Thanks.
Thank you. Kima Kirolomun.
Hello, my name is Kima Karolumum. I'm a single-family homeowner on Elm Street. I live at 410 West Elm. I moved out here a little over a year and a half ago, and just sort of speaking from the perspective of someone living in a single-family home on Elm Street, I'd like to speak out against the move for historic preservation. I think Elm Street, this corridor, has a lot to offer. There's a huge potential there for a very vibrant avenue, but as it is now, sort of what I've coming to, and coming with an outside perspective, there's a lot of stagnation, I guess you would say. The home I live in is a 155-year-old home, which I'm working to renovate and improve on, but at the same time, if you walk down the street, it's a shabby street as it is now. And I think the idea that if you enforce rules that sort of are going to encourage things as they are now, it's not ever going to invite a vibrant neighborhood that people will seek out. And I would love to see more people like me who are working to preserve the homes and sort of bring sort of a nicer look and life into the neighborhood. But yeah, I think as it is now, that is not really the reality of what is happening. So yeah, I think more development is only going to bring good things to that corridor. And as of someone living on the street, I would love to see more projects like the one being proposed for 611. Yeah, that's all I have to say.
Thank you very much. Brian Adams.
Brian Adams, 907 West Daniel Street in Champaign. I submitted the nomination for this property, and I just wanted to make a few comments about some of the statements that have been made about why I may have done this and the reasons behind it. First of all, I have nothing against development. I lived in that neighborhood for about 25 years. I lived in that neighborhood because I love the historic aspect and structures in the area. I'm a member of the PACA board. I have an intense respect and admiration for historic architecture. I served on the Illinois Historic Sites Advisory Council for 3 years. I've written a book on a local architect, Joseph William Royer. So I do this not out of anything against development. I do this out of my love for local architecture and local history. If I have anything against development, it's when it's being proposed for a district where the adaptive reuse of historic structures is the goal. So I don't do this, again, out of a dislike for development. I do this out of my respect and love for the history of the community. Too often, a lot of these structures are disappear by wear down, tear down. That's what almost happened to the Ricker House. Last week, I went into the PACA archives and looked at some before and after photographs of the PACA house. And before that house was renovated, it was in a lot worse condition than 611 West Elm. The ceilings were collapsing, the porch was collapsing. It was brought back. It's now a very very nice single-family residence. It can be done, and again, in a neighborhood where historic preservation is supposed to be respected and encouraged. I think that's one thing that you should take
Mr.
into
Adams, you have 1
consideration.
minute left.
Okay.
And I'd like to move for additional time because this is the nominator.
Second.
Thank you. West Elm Street, I've talked about this before, is a very important corridor in Urbana, extending from Ray Street to about to Busey Avenue, and very little of its historic appearance survives. The eastern 2 blocks was primarily commercial. Today, the eastern 2 blocks is primarily parking lots or parking spaces. All of the commercial historic appearance of that part of Elm Street's gone. Very little of the historic aspect of the 300 block survives. The 400 block is relatively intact on the north and south sides of the street. Moving to the 500 block, there are some very nice historic homes there. The two structures that I was involved in the nomination as local landmarks, the Freeman House at 504 West Elm, designed by Joseph Royer, and the Sutton Mansion next door at 502 West Elm. 2 very historic buildings that were slated for demolition before anybody knew anything about the important history of those buildings. And again, those nominations were not submitted to because the neighbors in the area were against development. It was because we wanted to keep those historic buildings in our neighborhood. Continuing to the 600 block, relatively intact in terms of historic residential structures. Once you get to the 700 block, I think there's only 1 historic structure left. The rest of those structures are large, overscale apartment buildings and parking lots. So with the exception of the couple of blocks in the center of the street, a very historic street which shows up on the 1833 plat of Urbana as one of the first streets platted in the city. Very little of its historic fabric remains, and so I would urge you to landmark this structure, approve the landmark of this structure to help us preserve what little is left of the historic fabric of this historic street. Thank you.
Thank you. Susan Appel.
Good evening. I'm Susan. It's Apple. Sorry.
Sorry.
It looks like Appel. I know. I am a professor emerita of architectural and art history from Illinois State University. I tell you that because I contributed to this nomination, particularly in the description of the structure in question. There's so many things I would like to say, but I would like to kind of try to keep it short. I would like to address this issue of an 11th hour nomination, and as has already been pointed out, I think that's a specious argument. I don't think there's any real way for interested citizens to know that there is a threat to a property until a demolition notice goes up on it, and that 45-day period in which one can consider the building kicks into effect. At any rate, when we saw that demolition notice, we proceeded to develop the nomination. There have been a number of references here tonight to the list of 100 most important buildings in Urbana. And I would like to mention that the fact that there is such a list does not preclude us from looking at other buildings as also historic. Much of the city of Urbana, in that central area particularly, is in fact historic in one way or another. And acknowledging that is a way to better understand not only the way the city developed, but also what is retained of its past history. I want to underscore with regard to 611 West Elm that this is a very good example of Dutch/neoclassical revival architecture. It comes from the very early 20th century, and it's part of a whole collection of buildings on at least the west end of that block that form a concentration of representative
You have
late
1 minute
19th
left.
and early 20th century buildings. They're of good size. They are of similar scale, material, and age. There's a concentration there that needs to be paid attention to. If you focus in on 611, which is a corner property, and if you allow it to be demolished, you're allowing a significant chunk to be taken out of that neighborhood. And to paraphrase something I heard about another related situation, it'll end up being like knocking a tooth out of the neighborhood's smile. You knock one tooth out, it opens the way for others to go. You open the way for losing the whole neighborhood. And I think that is unfortunate because, as Brian pointed out, in the block immediately to the west, nothing but large apartment buildings. You start putting one on this portion, and I don't see why you wouldn't get more, particularly since Mr.
And
Hunsinger
I'd like to
owns a lot of
allow this
property.
person to speak on another 2
I'm
minutes.
fine.
because
I'm done.
You are done? Okay.
That's-
Thank you very much. Thomas Garza?
My name is Thomas Garza. I live at 1212 West Park in Champaign, Illinois, and I'm here to speak in favor of the designation. I've heard a lot of people talking back and forth here and creating a scenario where this is sort of a contest between development and preservation. And they're using development as if it were synonymous with progress and preservation as if it were synonymous with stagnation. But I don't think that's the case here, because we're not talking about developing this property. We're talking about destroying the property and replacing it with something else. And we cannot take this house out of context. It is right next door to the Ricker House. It is part of a historic neighborhood, and it is an important and integral part of those things. And once it is gone forever, and it cannot be undone. So I will add one more point and say that I agree that the historic designation process is not the right way to do this, but we're here talking about this because the process has failed all the way down the line in terms of the zoning, the MOR designation, and all those things. Those need to be addressed, and I agree with Ms. Baxley that we should put a moratorium on demolitions until that can be resolved, because I think the point of that designation has been lost here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Steve Drake?
Okay, thank you. I live at 610 West Illinois, just a block south of the apartment that's in discussion here. I would like to just generally say that I'm in favor of the historic designation. I'd like to give my time to Dan Newman, if that's
To who?
possible. Dan Newman here behind
Okay.
me.
Thank you very much.
Just to get a feel for the people, could you raise your hand if you're in favor of the landmark designation? Okay, and could you raise your hand if you're opposed to the landmark designation? And could you put your hand down if you're on the payroll of Hunsinger or otherwise receive checks from Hunsinger?
Okay.
Are you on the
Would-
payroll of Hunsinger,
sir,
or do you receive
would-
checks from Hunsinger?
Sir, would you please just address the council? Thank you.
Thank you. So, first I want to apologize for sending you guys a really long email. I know that's, something that's not that cool, but oh, sorry, my name is Dan Newman. I live at 612 West Green Street in the Ricker House, right next door to the property where they're proposing to demolish and build a much larger structure. I brought a couple pictures. To me, the decision that's being made here is Will the City Council, based on your decisions, thank you, will the City Council insist that the future of Urbana looks like this? You can see these pictures here. These are in the MOR, 401 and 403 Illinois. These are student rentals. They are medium size and scale. They are remodeled buildings rather than demolished. Is this your future of Urbana? Or is this your future of Urbana? That's really the choice that you guys are making tonight as I see it. With regard to trying to speak as much truth as we can, I know both sides are prone to exaggeration. I do want to say something about the claim that this was an 11th hour proposal to stop the demolition. What actually is true is that Hunzinger filed the demolition application a month before the MOR board even heard the case. And so then when the application came in 2 weeks later, what was actually happening was he had filed the demolition application in order to prevent this discussion from happening. So really the 11th hour was him trying to do 11th hour to us, is the way it seems to me.
You have
right.
1 minute left.
Can somebody give me some more time? They're going to build something large in my backyard.
I'll propose that he has more time.
Okay, thank you.
Is
So,
anybody else in favor of that?
anyone else? Yep.
Okay. How much more time would you like?
As much as it takes.
Well, we have other people that would like to talk, so. I understand that. I think that's already been taken. I think, could you please continue, sir?
So do we have an agreement? What's the agreement?
I think he would like to speak a little bit more, but you can be brief, right? You said you
Yes, I
wanted
will
to take
try.
as much. Okay.
I will
thank
try to
you.
be brief.
How about one more minute? Would that be okay?
No, it's not going to be one more minute.
Well,
So-
we have all these people that would like to talk, and we'd like to get to the issue, so I would appreciate your consideration.
I will try to be brief.
Okay.
I'll
Thank
try to
you.
be brief.
Mayor, we have several people in the back who said they are willing to not speak if we allow this gentleman to speak.
Okay, so
And
who?
Given the fact that we have allowed other people to go on and not support the rule that is in place, I think it's unfair for us to
Okay.
not allow him to have the same
Okay.
amount of time that other people have.
Thank you. Could you tell me who wants to give their time to him? Would you say your name, please? Sarah Brown Schmidt. Okay, thank you. Diane Beck, thank you. Crystal Newman? Okay.
That's 9 minutes.
Let's not get into stupidity here, please.
Well, this is your suggestion.
Now, what was I'm just trying to make sure everybody has a chance to talk, and we do have a procedure that people can give their time to someone else.
Okay.
So who was the last person that said their name?
Daniel Bedoni.
Okay, thank you.
I think stupidity is some pretty harsh language for you to use, Madam
Oh, come
Mayor.
on, let's get going here.
You know, I agree with that, but I still think that was pretty inappropriate
Okay.
language for you to use.
So, the first question is the house at 611 West Elm actually a locally historic house? And so, the answer is that according to the particular definition of locally historic that's in the Urbana zoning ordinance, it is a locally historic property. The definition of locally historic is spelled out in the ordinance, and it's a fairly broad definition. It includes a lot of houses. More than the 100 most historic houses would be in the designation of locally historic according to the ordinance. We're not talking about Taj Mahal kind of historic properties. We're talking about locally historic houses. If you Google Urbana local landmarks, you'll see what sorts of houses meet this designation in Urbana, and the house at 611 West Elm fits squarely in this group. So an individual person might disagree with Urbana's definition of locally historic that is in the ordinance, but it's still in the ordinance as it's currently written. So what does it say? Under section, that's going to be 12.5.c of the Urbana zoning ordinance, the proposed landmark must meet one or more of 7 possible criteria in order to qualify for landmark designation. There are lots of criteria that could be talked about, and based on which angle you're coming from, you might see it as more or less meeting these criteria, but the slam dunk is criterion C. Representative of the distinguishing characteristics of an architectural type that is inherently valued to the study of a period, style, craftsmanship, method of construction, or use of indigenous materials while retaining a high degree of integrity. Now the city staff, and this is emblematic of the issue here, the city staff has been strongly in favor of the demolition, whereas the Historic Preservation Commission was against the demolition. But the city staff even had to allow that criterion C was met, with the single exception that the integrity of the building was perhaps not there because of the enclosed porch and because of the vinyl material of the windows. However, what we find is that according to Exhibit E on pages 44 to 48, a property is important for the definition of what integrity is, which is the reason why criterion C cannot be met. So again, the reason this minutia is important is because this determines legalistically whether it is a locally historic property. It might be a small H historic property, but this is the ordinance. So we find that the Historic Preservation Commission says that it does retain its character. A property is important for illustrating a particular architectural style or construction technique when it retains most of the physical features that constitute that style or technique. Most, more than half. A property that has lost some of its historic materials or details can be eligible if it retains the majority of the features that illustrate its style in terms of massing, spatial relationships, proportion, pattern of windows and doors, texture of materials, or ornamentation. The property is not eligible if it retains some basic features conveying massing, but has lost the majority of its features. So here we have what the house used to look like. This is what it looks like now, and if you compare the two, the question is, has the house lost most of its historic features? And the answer is no. So if this decision is made on the actual criteria of whether the house is locally historic, then there you have it. All right, second question. There are only three questions. Second question, is the proposed new construction in violation of the purpose and intent of the MOR district? So the zoning ordinance clearly states the purpose and intent of the MOR district. This is in the zoning ordinance today, the purpose of the MOR district where this house resides. The MOR, or Mixed Office Residential District, is intended to encourage a mixture of residential, office, and small-scale businesses that are limited in scale and intensity and designed and constructed to be compatible with existing structures in the district. The district is intended to encourage the adaptive reuse of existing older structures through incentives that will extend the useful life of such structures. New construction shall be designed and constructed in a manner that is consistent with the character of the district. The land uses permitted in the development regulations required in the MOR district are intended to protect nearby residential uses by limiting the scale and intensity of the uses and buildings that may locate in the district. We need a careful evaluation of the use-to-use compatibility so that the stability and value of surrounding properties are best protected. The proposed new complex fails in terms of limited scale and intensity because the property is 3 times bigger than the existing property. It fails in terms of compatibility with existing structures. It does not look anything like the properties around it. It fails in terms of adaptive reuse of older structures. It is not an adaptive reuse. And it fails in terms of protecting nearby residential uses and historic buildings. So it fails in terms of all of the stated purpose and intent of the MOR district. This is the kind of thing we're talking about. Here, the house on the left, look, these are both well-maintained properties from Hunzinger. It's to his credit that he keeps these properties very well-maintained. But the one on the left looks like a house. It has setbacks, it has a yard. The one on the right does not look like a house. The house on the right, the one on the right is house-shaped, but it is a large apartment complex. And some of the folks who have testified, and I've even read an email today, someone opposing the landmark designation, who says that this is what we should be looking for because it is a house-shaped apartment. But I do not want this kind of thing in my backyard, and I don't think this is, for me, this is not the vision of Urbana that I would choose. There's a distinction between houses west of Kohler, where you see really big, large, house-shaped, large-scale apartments, versus east of Kohler on Elm Street. On the upper left, we have the house across the street from the proposed demolition. It is a rental, student rental. I'm fine with student rentals. I'm fine with living among students. But this one looks like a house. It has a yard. It has a residential feel. This one here is right next door to the proposed demolition. Large setbacks, has a yard, looks like a house. Also a student rental. This is the reason why the place where I live has a residential feel, because these rentals are maintained according to the purpose and intent of the MOR district where I bought a house and where the MOR district says that they will protect my property. This is also one house down, a Royer designed house, again setbacks, large yard, looks like a house. Other houses east of Kohler on Elm Street, large setbacks, yards, look like a house. And so this is what they're planning to do. Put something that does not look like a house and that will ruin the residential feel of not only my property, but also coming up Kohler Street, coming down Elm, the entire look of the block will be changed. And that's the decision that you guys get to make tonight as elected officials. Is this the future, or is the other kind of property the future? One thing that's come in contention is whether the proposed property is actually 3 times bigger than the existing property. So this is from Hunsinger's website, downloaded this year, where as he's trying to rent this property out to people, he says it's 1,440 square feet. He did say in person that he's not sure how many square feet it is, but it's probably closer to 2,000. Either way, the proposed new property at 4625, it's either 3 times as large or 2.5 times as large. So it's much larger. That's not in debate. And why does that matter? Because it's outside of the character of the neighborhood. We fear that there will be a progression of these kinds of developments because Hunsinger owns all of these properties here. And so east of Kohler, you can get a domino effect where you sort of march down and transform the entire neighborhood. And that's why I'm especially listening to testimonies tonight from people who live in the neighborhood. All right, so can you remodel houses instead of demolishing them? Again, here are 3 examples that are within 2 blocks of the proposed house where they remodeled the house instead of demolishing it. And this is what I would like to live next to. This is what I enjoy living next to, whereas the big complex with the balconies and such is not something I want to live next to. My house was also rescued 20 years ago. This is what it looked like. So this speaks to the argument of whether the house is now too far gone for anyone to fix it. This is what my house used to look like, and PACA saved it and remodeled it. Same kind of thing could indeed happen to the house at 611 West Elm, especially since it's in much better condition than the Ricker house was. All right, lastly, this is an important thing. I wish that this conversation were not about the financial interests of the property owner, but he and his team of lawyers and professionals keep bringing up his financial interests. So if we want to speak about his financial interests, I think it would be fair to ask, how much did he originally pay for the house? He brought it up. How much did he originally pay for the house? How much has he brought in rent over the years from the house? And how much did he spend on maintenance and upkeep for the house? Then, once we put those numbers together, I think we'll see exactly what his definition of not profitable is. What's happened here is he's engaged in demolition by neglect. And so what I'm afraid of is that if this house gets demolished because it's no longer profitable as it used to be before it was neglected, then property owners have a simple loophole they can use to subvert the purpose of the MOR district. In short, if you allow your property to decay due to purposeful neglect, you can make the simple case that the property is no longer attractive and should be demolished. It doesn't look historic, it looks beaten up. But you caused that bad state of the property. And that the demolition is the only rational path to profitability now that I've sucked all the value out of a property. That's it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Andrea Decker. Okay. Thomas Nevins.
Thank you. I live at 606 West Indiana. I live roughly in the neighborhood. I'm a homeowner. I've been here for approximately 10 years, and I expect to be here for decades to come. I wouldn't want to live next to a large apartment building when I was led to believe, both by the MOR designation and the historic character of the neighborhood. I wouldn't want the houses next to me to be demolished and replaced with large apartment buildings. I would worry a great deal about the value of my property, and I think the historic designation should be approved. Thank you.
Thank you. Maria Bailey.
Hello. My name is Maria Bailey. I live at 309 West Elm. I'm one of the 2 single-family homeowners represented here today, and my family, who are at home now, right now. We are the only ones who are a family on Elm Street, on the entire corridor that's in question. There are a very short, small handful of the residential of the MOR in this corridor. I am one of them. My husband and I moved here 10 years ago with the intention of being here for a long time. We're affiliated with the university. We wanted a home. We wanted a home that we could be proud of. We wanted a neighborhood that we could grow into. We had our children here. There have been a couple of things mentioned tonight that I am the counter to what's been mentioned. We were young professionals. We are young professionals when we moved here, and we make use of the downtown, the market, the Lincoln Square Mall, all of the restaurants and shops. It is within our front yard. It is walking steps from our front door, and we love that. That's why we chose the house that we found and live in today and have been taken care of all these years. We are people who plan to be here for a long time. We are active in our community. We are active in Leal School. I mean, the destruction of houses that could potentially bring in people like us is a major concern and is a major issue in this community. This community is more than one apartment building. It is more than one house. It is more than one family. It is all of us. I am a taxpayer. I spend my money in Urbana. My children spend their time here. We utilize the social services of this town. We are who you want living here. Renters come and go. We are surrounded by renters. We acknowledge that. We are the people you want to stay. So this needs to be kept as a home so that potentially it could be purchased by a single family at some point in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Jeff Bayer.
Good evening. My name is Jeff Baer. Make this short and sweet. I'm just here to say that I am opposed to the designation. Thank you.
Thank you. Joe Wetzel.
Good evening, council members. My name is Joe Wetzel. I'm a local attorney here in Champaign County. And believe it or not, as an attorney, I've actually learned how to be very brief, and I will be brief this evening. I oppose the historical designation of 611 West Elm. As the council's members have already heard the original intent of the MOR, a vote for the designation of 611 West Elm would actually be a watering down of what it is actually meant to be historical in Urbana. I would like to see, as a young professional, as a member of this community, I would like to see growth, development in Urbana, as well as in Champaign, but also in Urbana primarily. I also have, there's been comments from neighbors, there's been comments from a lot of numerous individuals on each side of this particular issue. Mr. Hunsinger has designed a compatible structure that would fit within this neighborhood, and I want to see that encouraged, and I'd like to see that promoted. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris Beazle? I don't think I can quite read your name. Chris B? Okay. Ryan Christensen? Is Chris here? Okay. Would you like to speak?
Maybe you can read my handwriting. It's pretty bad.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. I couldn't quite read your name.
My name is Chris Beard. I've lived in Urbana for 35 years. Currently still do on the 400 block of West Elm Street, and just like to say that I'm opposed to the designation. So.
Thank you very much. Ryan Christensen. Kara McKinney or Kara McKinn?
I wish I could say I was a young professional. I live at 1003 South Orchard, so I'm just 2 blocks off of Lincoln, south of what we're talking about. And we've heard voices from Mahomet and Champaign, and I'd just like to chime in that while I'm an old professional, I live here with my kids and who go to school here, we work here, and we love Woona. There's a reason people come to Urbana. We've heard so much, oh, Champaign it's a shining star. Champaign is wonderful, it's great, but there's different strokes for different folks, and we like Urbana. You all do too, you're here. So what we value is different, and that's okay. When I think about the West Urbana neighborhood, I think about the American Planning Association's designation of a great neighborhood. And I just happened to be reading this while we were here. Let me read from their designation on their website. It says, located between 2 dynamic areas, the University of Illinois and downtown Urbana, West Urbana has maintained its unique neighborhood identity for more than a century. Refusing to succumb to the pressures of high-density development or issues surrounding absentee landlords, many historic properties remain today the result of an active citizenry and sustained planning efforts. That's in our designation as one of the 10 greatest neighborhoods in the nation. So of course I'm here to support that. Today I treated myself to Dunkin' Donuts coffee, and on my way to work I was going down University Avenue, and I don't make that way normally. I was astounded at the development. Surely we're kidding ourselves that there's going to be a lack of development for students. And that's in Urbana, across from the Gyro place. That you know that's all going to be raised soon, that whole corridor, I think. I mean, I'm not an expert, but it's heading down. It's making a march. We're going to be fine. And I'm just this argument that we need more development. We're not going to nickel and dime our way into financial success. As I can tell you with my master's in English, even I know that's not a successful argument. So we do desire development and redeveloped homes in Woona. You know, I think of the Cooney home that's that's on the intersection of Indiana and Kohler, and how they really redeveloped that into something beautiful, and that was nothing to start with. We know that from our sales that this neighborhood, with its designation, with its houses, with its amenities, sells quickly. Sometimes these houses go up and down within a day. So here's another opportunity. You have a family home next to this. You have the Ross family, big family, just 500 yards from this. So as I look to the northern part of Woona, and you have the Bailey family as an outpost, here's an opportunity to increase what we love. There's people that come and like Urbana. We're never going to be Champaign. We can't compete on that. So let's be us and do what we have been rated as 10 best neighborhoods in the nation. Let's keep it up. We're good at it. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And it's bedtime, so I'm not just leaving since I spoke. Thank you.
Thanks. Sarah Wiggins. Carl, is Sarah Wiggins here?
She gave her time.
Okay. All right. Carl Weingartner.
Thank you. I will try to keep my remarks to 10 sentences or less. At least I will try. I want to, some of my remarks will cover background and then 2 comments I have about this. I attended the commission meeting, I think it was on January 13th. I was impressed with how much attention and fairness I thought the commission gave to both sides. We went on till 10 o'clock at night, and when we didn't finish, it was scheduled to have more time on the 20th of January. Comment number one is I thank the Commission for their efforts to be fair and to let everyone speak. My second comment is I support the designation of the historic statement. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris Hefflinger?
Good evening. My name is Chris Haflinger, and I'm opposed to the historic designation. Thank you.
Thank you. Steve Ross?
Excuse me. Good evening. My name is Steve Ross. I'm a homeowner along with my wife in the MOR district. We're at 609 West Green Street. Excuse me. And I think the MOR has had a mixed record of success and failure. If you look at down the street, as Dan Newman pointed out, at 402 and 404 West Green, you see success. Those houses were kind of run down. They're in the same footprint now, but they look much better. If you look at me at 609, I think you see failure. The house immediately to our east is approximately twice as large. Its footprint expanded that much. The one immediately to our west was demolished and replaced with an apartment building that I believe is about 3 times the size of the original. So I guess what I'd like to say to you is that I think this is an example or a possibility where there can be another success in the mixed office residential where adaptive reuse can be favored over demolition. And one last comment, I guess. It's not an anti-development attitude, I don't believe. We're talking about Elm Street and Green Street, 2 thin ribbons through the heart of Urbana, and to put special conditions on development there is not an overly great burden, I don't think. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much. Elderess Melinda Carr does not want to speak, but she's concerned about the Dr. Ellis subdivision sewer problems. Zach Morrison?
Good evening, Council. My name is Zach Morrison. I'm a resident of Champaign, but I own and operate a business in Urbana. I own several rental properties in Urbana, and specifically a few in West Urbana. I'm opposed to the designation for many reasons that have already been stated tonight, such as increased safety from new construction or increased tax revenue from a larger development on this property. But my main reason for opposing the designation is that it cheapens the historic landmark status. As has been stated already, this property is not on the Urbana list of 100 most notable properties. And I agree that that alone does not mean it's not historic. But as an expert preservationist testified before the Historic Preservation Commission, this is not a house that deserves historic landmark status. Much of what we've heard tonight is that people who live in the neighborhood or who are Urbana residents don't want to see the development happen because they don't want to see the neighborhood or the nature of the neighborhood change. I can understand that and I can appreciate that. But that's not what is before you tonight. What's before you is to vote whether this is a historic property that deserves historic landmark status. And I believe that is a no, so I urge you to vote no and oppose this historic landmark designation status. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Matt Metcalf is in favor of the nomination. I gather he does not want to speak.
Oh, I do.
Oh, you are Matt Metcalf? Okay, I didn't get a card. I just got a note here.
Thank you for taking that. I appreciate it. Good evening. My name is Matt Metcalf. I live at 1201 East Harding Drive. I happen to be a member of the Historic Preservation Commission, though I am here primarily to speak as a citizen.
I'll say this, though. I think the Historic Preservation Commission did do a commendable job in reviewing the case that was brought before them. We heard the voices of our fellow citizens on both sides of the debate who came to speak about the importance of their neighborhoods. Both supporters and opponents of the nomination brought evidence, and we weighed that evidence and gave it thoughtful and deliberate consideration. A split vote does not happen very often. That's certainly the case. As the preliminary minutes from the meeting show, at the crux of that split was the concern about the condition of the nominated structure. All 6 commissioners agreed that the home carried the marks of being a historic Dutch colonial revival. All 6. Now, the central cleavage was whether the changes, such as the exchange of another bedroom for the porch or a leaky roof, impacted the integrity. And that's where that happened, if you were not able to view the meeting. Now, the commission cast its vote in already, and you already have all the material at your disposal, as it was our hope to inform you with our thoughts and opinions within the context as best as we could and as we are mandated to do. Now, to address a few points that we could not consider during our deliberations, the developer's attorney spoken that you could only consider the house. That's simply not true. And none of the context. You can't do that. That's just not the nature of historic preservation. Houses exist in context. People live in context. We live in neighborhoods. You can't put 50-foot walls down on the house and say, oh, peer down in here and determine whether this is historic. It just doesn't work that way. So on the one side tonight, you have a group of concerned citizens who recognize the value of history. Historic landmark nominations preserve both buildings and the sense of place, because that's, again, what historic preservation is about. It gives meaning to people and the community where they live. You have, on the other side, a developer who owns quite a few properties in town, $1.2 million in sales, according to the Illinois Secretary of State's office in 2014. That doesn't include the values of the properties themselves. So I get a little edgy when I hear complaints about spending $10,000 on looking at your property, because in the grand scheme of things, that ain't that much, for him anyway. There's a report to which council has been given access that outlines the costs of repairing the home. As Mr. Hunsinger's own developer has said, it's cost prohibitive to make repairs, and yet Mr. Whitsett, the appraiser hired by the developer, told the commission that most of the damage has happened to the home in the past 5 to 10 years. The current owner, the one asking for special dispensation tonight, has owned it for 12. So most of that happened on his watch. In the historic preservation field, for which I have 30 hours of credit and study, we call that demolition by neglect. So in short, he wants you to feel badly because he didn't take care of his property and now it's falling apart, and he basically wants us, as the citizens of Urbana, to subsidize his investments. There's also been a lot of discussion about the use of the word landmark. The implication is that it has to be a pristine structure that would make the cover of a national history magazine, and that's not the case, and it was never the case. That was not why this ordinance was created. By its nature, it's local, and local landmarks are places of value known to a community. It's about the people who live there, and that's why they come out to testify. That's why they want to. That's why we have so many voices that contribute to what it means to have a neighborhood and why that's important. So we've heard from a lot of those people within the neighborhood. All of these elements line up in support of the community from what we've heard. It's residents and their sense of place. Is this particular project worthy of an exception? Because ultimately that's what it is. You're asking for an exception to the historic preservation ordinances, to the zoning ordinances. You're asking for exceptions to the grand planning master plan of what we want to do with the city, what makes us distinctive, what makes us different. Is this one particular exception, which frankly, I think we've seen that this would probably put that part of town in the orbit of campus, not in the orbit of downtown. Is that worth it? And I think that we really need to consider that. That was something we couldn't consider on the Historic Preservation Commission, but that certainly is something that's in your purview to consider tonight. So I hope that you will. I hope that you will consider that. The men and women who came here tonight, they're trying to build community. I hope you will consider the hope of maintaining affordable housing in the area. I'm sure those rents are going to go up if the new structure is built. And I hope you will consider the traffic that will potentially come to the area. And the loss of the sense of place, which I think, as people have explained, once it's gone, it isn't there anymore. And that's part of what makes Urbana unique. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Is Ryan Christensen in the room? Okay, well, thank you all for your testimony. We will move on. Reports of standing committees. Who was the chair of the committee of the whole?
I was.
You were. Okay, go ahead.
Right.
So, resolution number 2016-01-004R, a resolution approving a local agency agreement for federal participation with the Illinois Department of Transportation, Lincoln Avenue construction from Olympia Drive to Saline Court, section number 11-00334-01-PV, Public Works. So, on behalf of the committee, I so move.
Second.
Okay, motion by Ammons, seconded by Brown. Any discussion? Would the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Ammons?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Jacobson?
Yes.
Mr. Madigan?
Yes.
Ms. Marlin?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Smythe?
Yes.
Mayor Present?
Yes. That motion carries.
Resolution number 2016-01-005R, resolution for improvement by municipality under the Illinois Highway Code, North Lincoln Avenue improvements, construction, engineering, and utilities. On behalf of the committee, I so move.
Second.
Motion by Ammons, seconded by Brown. Any discussion? Would the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Ammons?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Jacobson?
Yes.
Mr. Madigan?
Yes.
Ms. Marlin?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Smythe?
Yes.
That motion carries.
Ordinance number 2016-01-005, an ordinance revising the fiscal year 2015-2016 annual budget, marketing enterprise zone, workers' comp claim, and miscellaneous items. On behalf of the committee, I so move.
Second.
Motion by Ammons, seconded by Marlin. Any discussion? Mr. Roberts.
I'd just like to support it, and partly because this is the Sister City Committee here locally to pay some bills that are outstanding.
Okay, thank you. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Ammons?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Jacobson?
Yes.
Mr. Madigan?
Yes.
Ms. Marlin?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Smythe?
Yes.
Mayor Present?
Yes. That motion carries.
Ordinance number 2016-01-006, an ordinance to repeal Urbana City Code Chapter 2, Article 5, Section 2-101, repeal of city ordinance requiring non-elected employees to retire at age 70 years. On behalf of the committee, I so move.
I'll second.
Motion by Ammons, seconded by Roberts. Any discussion? Would the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Ammons?
Do we need somebody over 70 to second that?
I'll second that.
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Jacobson?
Yes.
Mr. Madigan?
On behalf of Charlie, yes.
Ms. Marlin?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Smythe?
Yes.
That motion carries. Okay, reports of special committees. I don't believe we have any. Reports of officers. Okay, new business. Ordinance number 2016-02-007, an ordinance designating a historic landmark, 611 West Elm Street, the Henson House, historic preservation case number HP 2015-L-01. And here to discuss this is our staff.
Good evening. Oh, did we get a new microphone up here? I like that. Okay. So I feel like I might sound like a broken record if I tell you I'm going to try and be brief. But I'm going to try and be brief here. Yeah, I probably won't need that for a little bit. Okay, so this case is an application that was submitted by Brian Adams to designate the house at 611 West Elm Street as a local historic landmark. Hunsinger Enterprises is the property owner, and they have filed a valid protest against the application, which is attached to your memo. The Historic Preservation Commission held 3 public hearings on this matter, and on January 20th, the HPC recommended approval of the application to the City Council by a vote of 4-2 in favor.
Since the property owner has filed a valid protest, this application shall only be approved by a minimum 2/3 vote of the alderpersons holding office, excepting those who abstain for reasons of a proclaimed conflict of interest. For a little background on the property, there are a couple of related cases that we've heard about a little bit tonight. One of them was DRB 2015-01, and that was a case that went to the, it was a site plan review case that went to the MOR Design Review Board. And that site plan proposed the demolition of the house at 611 West Elm Street and the creation of a 3-story, 5-unit apartment building on the site. On September 30th of last year, the MOR Development Review Board approved the proposed development subject to some conditions designed to mitigate negative impacts on the Ricker House property, which is adjacent. Also, 611 West Elm Street is on the demolition delay list, which was designed to encourage the identification and designation of additional historic landmarks within the city of Urbana. During the 45-day demo delay period, properties can be nominated for landmark designations, and that is what happened in this case. So a demolition permit cannot be issued until the current case is resolved. There are a couple of nearby landmarks, including the Ricker House, Buena Vista Court, the Bills House, the Freeman House, and the Sutton House. Well, the Ricker House, as I mentioned, is adjacent. Buena Vista Court and the other houses are along Elm Street within a couple of blocks. Some history about the property itself. The house was built around 1902 and 1903 for Stephen S. Henson. And Mr. Henson moved to Urbana from Douglas County in 1903 after retiring. He died the following year. The house remained in the family until between 1910 and 1920. And since 1970, the house has been used as a rental property. The house does exhibit many intact characteristics of the Dutch Colonial Revival architectural style, including a cross gambrel roof, second-story shed-style dormer window, and cladding in clapboard and shingle that is consistent with Colonial Revival houses. The house has undergone some alterations over time, including the removal of architectural features from the original porch and the enclosure of the original porch, the replacement of the front steps with concrete steps, and the installation of an exterior staircase on the east side of the house. Section 12.5C of the Urbana zoning ordinance requires that a proposed landmark must meet one or more of 7 possible criteria in order to qualify for landmark designation. The application stated that 611 West Elm Street meets 2 of those 7 criteria, so I will focus on those, as that's what the application and the Historic Preservation Commission and our staff memo focused on. I do want to make it a point to say that these criteria, the landmark criteria, are the only relevant criteria that this application should be considered under. The property already went through the MOR Design Review Board, so all that we're focusing on are whether the property meets the landmark criteria. So the first criteria, criterion A, states that the property has significant value as part of the architectural, artistic, civic, cultural, economic, educational, ethnic, political, or social heritage of the nation, state, or community. The application provides quite a thorough summary of the early social and economic development of the West Urbana neighborhood and the important role that West Elm Street played in that early history. And it also provides information about the home's original owner, Stephen S. Henson, and his family. In the staff analysis, it was noted that although the application did provide information about the importance of West Elm Street, it did not clearly explain the role that 611 West Elm Street or Mr. Henson or his family played in that history. The analysis concluded that 611 West Elm Street did not meet this criterion. At the Historic at the conclusion of the public hearing, the Historic Preservation Commission found that 611 West Elm Street has significant value as part of the architectural heritage of Urbana and meets this criterion. The HPC cited the house's significance to Urbana's architectural heritage as being one of the few remaining late 19th and early 20th century homes along Elm Street. There's more information in the attachments of the memo if you'd like more information on that. Moving on to criterion C, that states that a property is representative of the distinguishing characteristics of an architectural type inherently valuable for the study of a period, style, craftsmanship, method of construction, or use of indigenous materials while retaining a high degree of integrity. The application identifies the house as a unique example of a Dutch colonial revival house that retains a high degree of integrity. It describes many architectural features of the house in detail, which you can find in Exhibit B of the attached memo to the Historic Preservation Commission. In the staff analysis, it was noted that the house at 611 West Elm Street exhibits and retains many characteristics of the Dutch colonial revival style. But staff does not believe that the house retains its historic integrity due mostly to the enclosure of the front porch and the replacement of most of the original windows with final windows. The staff conclusion was that it did not meet this criterion. After the public hearing, the Historic Preservation Commission found that 611 West Elm Street is representative of the Dutch colonial revival architectural style and retains a high degree of integrity and meets this criterion. Again, you can refer to the meeting notes from the Historic Preservation Commission public hearings for more on that. So the options that the City Council has in this case, Council shall find whether or not the nomination meets one or more of the criteria for designation as a local landmark and approve the application by enacting an ordinance or deny the application. The Historic Preservation Commission voted 4-2 in favor of recommending that the City Council approve the application based on 611 West Elm Street qualifying under criteria A and C of Section 12-5C of the Urbana Zoning Ordinance. Staff recommends that the City Council deny the application based on the analysis provided in the staff memo to the HPC from December 31st of 2015. I hope I kept that brief. That concludes my report, and I can take questions.
Diane?
Just so things are perfectly clear to me, we've heard a lot of input regarding neighborhood context, the interior of the house, the intent of the MOR, and that sort of thing, as well as the specific criteria. Can you tell me specifically what our decision tonight must be based on?
As I stated, there was a case that went through the MOR Design Review Board that was approved. The only criteria that you should be looking at tonight are whether or not the property meets the historic landmark designation criteria.
Those 7 criteria?
Correct.
Thank you.
Aaron?
Who determines the criteria that determines whether or not a house is historic? Who sets those guidelines?
Well,
as it is part of the zoning ordinance, it went through a process like any text amendment for the zoning ordinance. So approval by, or excuse me, recommendation by Plan Commission and final approval by City Council. There are other steps because it is historic preservation, other reviews by other bodies, but in order to make it into the zoning ordinance, it needed to come through here.
So this criteria that we're looking at tonight was ultimately set by a council years ago.
That's correct.
And then the council agreed that only one of these criteria need to be met in order to designate a home to be historic.
One is correct, but it looks like Libby wanted to add to the statement.
Yeah, I would just state that these criteria are not unique to Urbana. They're based on model language from the National Park Service, Department of Interior standards, so they are common criteria for historic preservation landmarks.
Okay. And just my last question is, because some of the language, like, that the house retains a high degree of integrity, how do you, as staff, is there some basis that you go on and say, look, this is high degree of integrity and this is not?
Yeah, again, we rely on national sort of standards that are set, but then you tailor them to the local setting. We, for the purposes of making our evaluation, we first went to our historic preservation plan from 1998, which has a definition for integrity, and I can read that for you if you'd like.
Sure.
Okay. It might not make things much clearer, but yeah. Oh, I got tagged it. Okay, and this is on. Sorry, I didn't number these pages too well in the memo. There is a page marked page 4 that was in the Historic Preservation Commission memo. So at the bottom of that page, it says that historic integrity is the authenticity of a property's historic identity, evidenced by the survival of physical characteristics that existed during the property's prehistoric or historic period. Integrity enables a property to illustrate significant aspects of its past. Qualities of historic integrity may include location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. All 7 qualities do not need to be present for eligibility, as long as the overall sense of past time and place is evident.
Okay.
No, go ahead if you have a...
I just don't know if if that helped a whole lot, but I do think that, you know, when I think about when I envision the house that we're talking about, you all point out that the porch is not there anymore and that the windows are not the same. But certainly it appears to be just like it was, other than those 2 things. I mean, even the windows, I don't know if the average person would look at the windows and say, hey, those are not historic windows. But the porch, I mean, it certainly changes the dynamic, but I don't think it changes the majority of the look of the house. So I'm just, this whole idea of how much something has changed, it seems to me it would have to be like obvious that this is just not even close to what it used to be in order for you to say that the integrity has been interrupted. And I was just trying to figure out how you all came to that conclusion, but there's a lot for me to consider, but that was helpful to some degree.
Eric?
What impact or weight should we give to the fact that it's in the MOR district as opposed to being somewhere else? Because the MOR district, which is the subject of an ordinance, says to promote the conservation of buildings and neighborhoods which in combination or individually are of unique community and neighborhood significance. Doesn't that imply that, for example, the being adjacent to the Bricker House in the MOR ordinance suggests that that should have some weight, should it not, or should it not?
Well, I'm not totally sure if it should have weight or if it should not, but in reading the historic preservation section of our ordinance, there is nothing in there that says we should give additional weight to a property, whether it's in one zone or not. I feel like the rules that we set for the MOR district should be tailored to try and accomplish the goals of the intent of the district. So I think that that's where we should find the rules that would encourage preservation or adaptive reuse in the MOR district itself. But looking at the historic preservation ordinance, I don't think that there's anything in there that says this area should have more weight than any other.
Libby?
With respect to the MOR district, there's a lot to the purpose there, and there was earlier some older versions of the intent. We've conducted an analysis of the proposed project for its conformance to the MOR, and we believe that it is entirely consistent with the MOR in terms of the regulations, and it's undergone the formal review process for development under the MOR. In the historic preservation section, we don't make reference to different zones. You know, in R2 you do this, in R3 you do that. That's not what we're looking at. We're looking at this property and whether it meets the historic landmark criteria. We have other tools for applying zoning, but tonight's decision is about the landmark. It's not about the MOR or the development plan. It's about the landmark and those 7 criteria, and we're really focusing in on the 2.
Dennis?
As to integrity, it came out very clearly that...
Is your microphone on?
No, it's not. Thank you. I did listen to the lengthy presentations at the HPC meeting. And there was a large discussion about integrity because that's mentioned in the ordinance. And I actually had printed out specific information about it, but I decided to not bring it with me because I thought we had so much information already. But I almost wished I had, because the discussion talked specifically, and Chair Novak discussed an article in a Bulletin of American Historical Conservation or something, I don't know what the bulletin was called, that explained how integrity of a building is to be evaluated. And her expertise, and that of Mr. Metcalf, who's also on the commission, summarized that integrity means that there are present the elements that distinguish the style, and we're talking about, in this instance, the Dutch colonial revival style. That the integrity did not address the current condition. And then they went on to enumerate the numerous integrally present elements of this particular style in this particular house on this particular block. And now we're not talking about, are these nicer than the ones on some other block nearby? We're talking about this house. This is also, by the way, the first house that this particular style is going to be potentially represented in a historic landmark case for the city. There might be other nice ones out there, but they're not before us today. So my question is, apparently the enclosure of the porch, which removed the open space and removed the pillars, but left the detailing of the cornice of the porch visibly intact, probably must be about at least maybe only 1/6 or at the most 1/5 of the entire floor space of the building. Now, from what I observed of the building and of the photographs, the porch is the only serious alteration to the building. If you go to the side of the building or the back of the building, there's no change at all historically. So what I'm wondering is, it seems to me that there's plenty of integrity, and that certainly there's more than probably 2/3 integrity of the building, but staff didn't agree, and I'm wondering why.
Well, first, thank you for pointing out the discussion about condition. versus, or as a component, or not really as a component of integrity, because as they did point out at the HPC, the condition of a house or of a building, unless the condition is so deteriorated that you can't tell what it was to begin with, the condition does not factor into integrity. So in terms of looking at this house and its integrity, it does, yes, most of the things outside of the porch do appear to be original, other than the replacement of many of the windows with vinyl windows. But the porch, looking at the house from Elm Street, which I think we could all probably agree is the important view to be looking at the house from, the porch takes up about a third of what you see when you look at the house. So I think really the question of integrity is whether the enclosure of that porch and also the replacement of basically everything below the cornice line. The question is whether the replacement of all of that material has damaged the integrity so that the building doesn't retain its integrity. And from our staff perspective, that seemed to remove a lot of the character of the house and diminish its integrity, such that you wouldn't look at the house and say this is a great example of a Dutch colonial revival house that retains its integrity.
This house is on a corner, and there's another street that goes along the side of the house, and a person can look at the house from that angle as well. And from that angle, there are no changes from the historical structure of the building. Are you saying that we can't walk around on a second street and look at the same building from another angle and decide whether there's integrity? Or even look at the backyard and find out that from the back of the house, the entire back elevation of the house hasn't been changed. So that's on three sides we have much more integrity than the front. So we're not allowed to consider the entire house? What's wrong with, how would that be wrong?
Well, I mean, in general, you would consider...
Oh, in general, you would?
No, in general, you would consider what you can see from the public right-of-way. So you're not going to look at all four sides of the house.
But if you're on a corner, you would see two sides.
That's correct.
So at least there would be two facades. If there was a serious construction that changed the facade on, what is it, Kohler Street? Is that the street that's...
Yes, yeah.
Then that would be even more serious a problem, wouldn't that be? That might play into the determination about integrity, wouldn't it?
I'm sure it could. Yeah.
So if there was not, then it would also play into the establishment of integrity as being possibly even more integrated. Whatever that word is. I'm just trying to figure out how many views or what part of the house we're supposed to be evaluating. We're talking about the roof at one point. We're talking about steps. So I'm just trying to understand to what percent of this house has changed that throws it out of the box of integrity. And I'm not seeing very much. Okay. I want to say that I found 4 other instances, several of them on Elm Street, where the front porch of a historic building has been reconstructed. And it may not be landmarks, but they were successfully reconstructed to return the house to its significant historic look. And that architects and people of will are able to return homes to significant historic beauty if they choose to. Okay.
Bill Brown.
I just had a question about during one of the meetings, I forget if it was the first or second one I watched, or third, were there 3? Yeah.
There were 2 full meetings.
Okay.
One was just a open, and then we continued it immediately.
There was, the owners said that the occupancy had to be lowered from 6 to 4 people. And I thought there were 2 units. Is there an upstairs unit, a downstairs unit? No, it's all 1 unit.
Yeah.
So as part of the MOR, does the rooming house come into play? Could he have asked to make this a rooming house, or why was that occupancy lowered?
Is that relevant?
It's,
I think it is relevant because it goes to economic viability, which is relevant.
No, it's not. Economic viability isn't actually one of the considerations that we have before us.
Well, according to the purpose of the ordinance, it says it's to promote the educational, cultural, economic, and general welfare of the community by so on, so on, so on. So I think that, to me, says that economic viability is important.
So, do you want to answer?
Sure. While a rooming house is a permitted use in the MR, typically there are a lot of thresholds that need to be met for the building code that often make it not really financially feasible. I don't know if that's the case here, but that's often a case that we hear.
Thanks.
And when, I have a question, and following up on Bill's, when and where in the historic preservation ordinance is a person is a property owner able to discuss economic hardship? When does that take place? At this time?
No, that would take place if a property is landmarked. Then a property owner can apply for a certificate of economic hardship, and then they would come and prove, or an attempt to prove a case for economic hardship.
So there's a place for discussing the economics of the property owner, whether it is going to be to the maximum profitability of the property or not. But that is actually in the ordinance, and that comes at a later step. Is
That's
that correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
Is there a motion?
I'd like to make a motion of approval of historic nomination.
Is there a second? Aaron?
Yeah, I had some other questions.
Well, we can ask questions, but let's see if we can get a motion. Do you want to do second or not? You're not ready. Okay.
No, I'm not ready to vote on it.
Okay. Continue with the questions.
So, I know that you're saying that we should only consider whether or not this is a historic site. I don't believe that the council's job is to only consider whether or not it's a historic site, because there are too many other factors for us as city council members to only consider just that component, especially when Historic Preservation Committee has said that it is a historic site, and the MOR says that it should be used to develop. So I think that there's 2 trusted entities, and the staff is recommending that we not approve the historic site. So there's just too many moving parts here for me from the standpoint of development and all the other things to just consider whether or not this is a historic site. That is not my expertise. I'm trying to take into consideration all of the things that we have heard tonight. So one of the questions I have is, do we have historic areas in which we focus and say that all of the houses and buildings in this area will maintain the historical integrity? Or do we just simply say, we walk down the street and say, hey, I think that's a historic house, and no matter where it's at, it gets deemed historic, and then we have to build around it? I just really want to understand how this process works.
Well, we do have historic districts that we've created that say, well, there are different types of properties within those districts. There are sort of the lesser historic properties that are called non-contributing properties, which don't have to adhere to as high of standards for any exterior work that's done on those properties. But then there's contributing houses or buildings that contribute to the historic character of the district, and those buildings do have to adhere to higher standards for changes.
So this particular area of Elm Street, is it a historic area?
It is not.
But the MOR suggests to some degree that it is, because we don't, I mean, help me understand that.
Well, maybe Libby can help out since she has more background
Yeah,
on this.
the MOR was about a vision of trying to provide for the viability of Green Street and Elm Street, that corridor between downtown and campus. It came out of the downtown to campus plan, which resulted in a lot of rezonings and a lot of downzonings in other areas. But in this area, it was an attempt to be creative, to allow development, but not of such a scale. So it was a reaction to apartment buildings that came about from consolidation of multiple lots, and they were out of scale. So it's really an urban design question. And in the MOR, there are allowed, by right, many uses, commercial and residential, full gamut, mixed office residential. So it is one of our higher zones, but in order to develop in this area, you have some special limits on the bulk of buildings, how much the floor area ratio can be, and you have site plan review. Initially, there was a staff process of site plan review, and then that evolved into a design and outside design review committee. So there isn't a preservation right in the MOR. We deal in our zoning ordinance with historic preservation very differently from our zoning districts. So historic preservation is something that can be applied anywhere in the city on either a landmark basis or a district basis. There is a council goal to try to create a district on another part of Elm Street, further east of this location. We, a few years back, worked with the neighborhood to try to see if we could get the momentum to do that, and there wasn't at that time the support. And again, this was to the east of this particular site. In the district, then you've, not only do you have the MOR, but then you have another zoning overlay of a landmark of an historic district. So I think it's important that we not mix the historic preservation provisions and regulations with our zoning, our zoning designations. And that's why we've encouraged you tonight to stick with the historic preservation section. We know there's lots of larger issues that come into play, and to really try to focus on these two criteria, the integrity that we've talked about, and we'll try to show you the photographs so you can see, does it retain that high degree of integrity? And that's apparently where the staff differed from the 4 preservation commissioners. So I don't know if that helps. The MOR is partially successful. The buildings that Mr. Ross talked about, that one is on one side of his home, another on the other. He lives on 600 block of Green Street. They are much smaller than they would have been without the MOR, and they have a better design than they would have. You go across the street to the Campus Oaks development, that's pre-MOR. So that was a purpose of the MOR. Another purpose was we hoped to encourage more adaptive reuse. We do that not by saying everybody must adaptively reuse, but we say if you want to adaptively reuse, we're going to make your review process go quicker. So you're going to have some things by right. So we have some mechanisms to try to promote adaptive reuse, but it's also about mixed office residential development, and we always had a hope that we would have more commercial use on Green Street, more conversions of homes to businesses. We have some of those, but maybe not as much as was once envisioned.
Okay, so I've heard a couple of comments tonight as it relates to the homeowner, Mr. How do you say? Hutzinger. I've heard from Mr. Newman when he presented that that your upkeep of the other properties were decent. I don't think anyone here was referring to you as a slum landlord. I didn't hear those comments, but I did hear demolition by default or something like that, by neglect. And I do find it troubling that, you know, you would have other properties in good shape, and I don't understand why this one wasn't able to be maintained. And there was so much information that I've received about this, and it makes it difficult for me to see whether or not this was some sort of neglect. I'm kind of hard-pressed to believe that you did that on purpose. But it's troubling to me to see that this is that it's not being reused, you know, and from the MOR fashion. It's just so many different parts to this, and so many different things that I feel like we should consider. But are there incentives? I saw that in the ordinance. What are the incentives for individuals who say, I'm going to keep this property and I'll follow the MOR guidelines for reuse? Do we give money? What do we do as an incentive for them to not choose the path that he's choosing now?
So it's my understanding that in the MOR district, if you're going to adaptively reuse your property, you would get administrative review for your development, as opposed to having to go through any board. Is that correct? Yeah.
So you get a review. That's the incentive for you to.
Well, it's a faster. It's quicker. Yeah, it's quicker, and since time is money.
I guess Diane and then Dennis.
Well, because there are so many moving parts to consider and a lot that we had to read for this meeting, I wondered if the city attorney could clarify from his perspective, what limits, do we have limits on what we consider? Because we have to be able to work with within some parameters, otherwise we're going to be wandering off in 7 different directions in making our decision. I think we have to have some consistency in the framework we're operating under.
Zoning ordinance 12, Roman numeral 12, -5, or E, decisions on designation, and you jump down to 2, city council authority provides, if the city council determines that the proposed historic landmark should be designated, it shall do so by enacting an ordinance. The key term is designated. When you go back to the landmarking criteria, which are in that same section, you go to subsection C, sub 1, landmarking criteria. It says a proposed landmark must meet one or more of the following criteria for designation. So your role is to designate, and you must determine that the property, the subject property under consideration, does or does not meet landmarking. If you look at A, as I believe staff has reported, economic considerations can be taken into account because that's what A provides. Clearly, there is an additional process once a landmarking has occurred, if such a landmarking should occur, which when the owner of the property chooses to undertake renovation, or for that matter demolition of the property, the owner can apply for an economic hardship. So the council, the way I read the ordinance, is confined to the criteria. Either it meets one of them, all it has to do is meet one, or it doesn't. In terms of the Moore district, those are, they're not reflected, Moore is not reflected in these criteria.
Thank you.
Dennis?
Yes, and so going back to the criteria, we have criterion A, and yes, the word economic is in it, but of course it has to do with the economic aspect of the house in question, which is under nomination, and not about anybody else's economic situation. But it also has to do with criterion A, has to do with its architectural importance, its artistic importance, its civic importance, its cultural importance, its educational importance, its political or social heritage of the community. Interestingly enough, and I guess that I guess we're not able to talk about this, although it's interesting. In new information, new information will come up when a case is presented, which the nominator may not have known about. Are we able to include the new information that may have to do with the historic aspect of the building that wasn't known to the original nominator at the time, but has been presented to the commission, the Historic Preservation Commission, during its discussion or deliberation?
I believe you should limit yourself to the record that was presented before the HPC and the factual assertions, i.e., if there was evidence presented tonight other than opinions, you can rely on what's been presented in the public forum. If somebody has submitted an email with other information, I don't believe it would be appropriate to rely on that, because whichever side the email favors, the other side has not had an opportunity to cross-examine that evidence and to test the veracity. To rely on outside information could constitute a denial of procedural due process.
So the fact that a person whose family lived in the building for a number of years and could say that members of her family were illustrious for various reasons due to their serving in World War I and II, captain of the Urbana football team, member of a jazz band, Dixieland band, photographer for the Courier newspaper, or was a civil rights activist who walked with Martin Luther King, would no longer be considered to be valid or appropriate. Is that right?
I can't say. If that information was presented in the public record, it could be considered.
Okay, that was
if it's
received
not
as
part
an
of the
email.
public record, then again, that would be an ex parte communication, which one side or the other would not have the opportunity to cross-examine and test the veracity of the purported information.
Okay. And finally, I had one other thought, if I can go back to that. So we're left with criterion C, especially, as being important, and this has distinguishing characteristics of an architectural type, which retains a high degree of integrity. And we've sort of determined that although the porch is changed, it's not the major part of the building, and nor is it the only view on which the building can be seen. So there must be just lots of integrity there as far as architectural details. The importance of the house can be determined, or we can accept this nomination based on that alone, even though it also probably makes, although the Historic Preservation Commission voted by majority that it met the qualifications on 2 terms. Staff recommended at the beginning of the meeting that it didn't agree to that the building met the criterion. And I want to ask this question. That recommendation was proffered by staff before the opening, the opening of the formal testimony by the nominator, or the rebuttal by the plaintiff, if I call him that. And my impression would be that staff would be in error to make any recommendation at all until testimony had been conducted. So I don't understand why we should necessarily highly merit staff's recommendation, because due process of public opinion had not yet occurred.
Diane?
I would point out that in the two previous cases with the Sutton House and the ZTA House, staff also made an opinion, and in those two cases they recommended in favor of historic designation, and there were no protests about that. So I think it's staff's responsibility to give their best opinion in each case.
Wouldn't that be better, though, to have the opinion come after the testimony rather than before?
Well, that's a matter of opinion, I guess. But
Well, I think it's a matter of
Mr.
procedure.
Simon, I have a question. The property rights of the owner are not addressed in our ordinance, right? The issue of a taking, that is other law?
I mean, the whole ordinance involves some kind of positive or negative impact on the property. A designation would alter the owner's property rights. It could prohibit him or her, or it in this case, from doing certain things with the property. It could, depending on what the owner wishes to do, increase the cost of doing it in order to, have whatever materials are used meet, the style of the house. Or the owner can apply for one of these economic or appropriateness certificates, which means they have to take time and effort, and as well as abide by the decision of the Historic Preservation Commission in determining whether their application for certificate of appropriateness or economic hardship has merit. So once the building is designated, if it is designated, it will have a potential significant impact. As I read the ordinance, there is nothing in the ordinance, the Historic Preservation Ordinance, that requires the owner to affirmatively update, improve, restore the building. But if the owner decides to do that, within certain classifications, and there's a table within the ordinance that provides, depending on the nature of the improvements that the owner seeks to do, what they can do with or without approval. And it can go all the way up to an application, economic hardship, to demolish the structure. But they have to abide by what the Historic Preservation Commission decides in terms of the particular levels of review or the types of review.
But the fact that they have protested this requires a supermajority on the
Yes.
city council because of the economic impact on the owner. Is that correct?
Though it's not written in terms of why it's
But
in
I mean,
there,
that's the
but the logical
context of American jurisprudence.
Yeah, I mean that was. I mean, there is a recognition because of the protest and the supermajority that this process could implicate the owner's property rights.
Okay, thank you. Dennis?
One more thing. Could you please enumerate the benefits of landmarking for the owner? I.e., there are certain privileges which economically offset some of the conditions of making repair.
Well, that's dependent on what you would want to do with the property. If you go all the way and get National Register designation for a property, you can get, and you have an income-producing property. So if you had an apartment building or some other building that was producing income for you, you can get a 20% tax credit. That does not apply if you're just a local landmark. If you wanted to reuse a single-family home or, say, an apartment building, and you were to live in one of the units, you can get a tax freeze for 8 years on your property taxes if you invest 25% or more into the property to rehab it. And then after those 8 years of having your property taxes frozen. So, I mean, the benefit of that is that you don't pay the additional assessed value that would be on the property of making those improvements. After those 8 years, there's a 4-year thaw period where your taxes gradually ramp up to what they would
to what they would be based on the assessed value. There are some other random
What about
benefits.
city permits?
Oh, yes, thank you. We waive all permit fees for building permits for historic landmarks. Thank you.
Is there a discount on materials? Maybe not.
I don't
But
believe so.
all permit fees are waived.
Building
permit
fees, yeah.
Okay, that would be repair, that would be electric, plumbing.
Yeah, if you wanted to replace the roof, yeah, stuff
Okay.
like that.
Okay, so there are actually some benefits that the city offers which aren't available even on the national level.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Mr. Jacobson.
Mr. Simon, I'm in need of some advice. Mr. Thies has suggested that I shouldn't participate, or at least shouldn't vote. And I just would explain the circumstance. This is in my ward, and I became aware that many people in my ward felt strongly about this, and there was a hearing coming up, and perhaps naively, I thought I was representing, or I was representing representing my own views, which were well aligned with my constituents' views, and I sent the email that Mr. Thies referred to. And I still don't know, what ordinance or statute or whatever I may have violated. But I don't necessarily want to take advice from the opposition's lawyer. I need advice from my lawyer. So, can you advise me? You're taking a position in opposition to the view that I expressed, okay, in my email. So, and we're all friends, but nevertheless, I'm not a lawyer. So so my question is, did I do something wrong, and what should I do now?
I will give you thoughts, but I will not tell you what you need to do, unfortunately.
You're not going to give me advice, but
I'm
going
to explain the situation.
Okay.
The council in this role is sitting in a quasi-adjudicatory administrative role. You are adjudicating a property owner's property rights. As Alderman Roberts has pointed out, there can be some benefits. As others have pointed out, there can be some detriments. You are, in either instance, altering property rights, and you are sitting in an adjudicatory role. I would liken somebody who takes a public position before the evidence, and then I will address the role of staff, but somebody who takes a position before all the evidence has been presented in the public forum, akin to a judge in a bench trial, i.e. no jury, stepping down from the bench in the middle of the trial, walking around, sitting in the witness stand, and giving testimony for the prosecution or for the defense, and then stepping around to get back on the bench to rule on that case, including considering his or her own testimony. I question whether that evidences advanced bias, that is, predetermination of a case before the evidence. Now, with that stated, there is no law that says, or ordinance that says you have to recuse yourself. And there is no law that says you should not recuse yourself. That's one of these quasi-conflicts of interest, or one could potentially charge biasness before the evidence has been presented. Obviously, after evidence is presented and after people have had a chance, and just about everyone on the council, maybe one or two exceptions, has spoken on their views, having heard the public hearing, having read the record before the HPC. Obviously, they're biased. But they're going to take a vote, and that's bias. But when you express a biased position in advance of hearing the evidence and then are on the body that's going to be voting, that could be a serious procedural issue as I see it.
Okay. Okay. So at least I haven't done anything criminal. Yet.
No, but I'll visit you on Sundays.
Okay.
Can I jump in and ask a question?
Charlie? Yes, please, go ahead.
Yeah, well, Jim, to follow up on Eric's issue here, how is Eric's general statements in support of historic preservation any different than a politician running on a platform that in general supports preservation?
Because there's no then current issue on which that politician, no actual fact situation on which that politician will vote. If you follow the U.S. Supreme Court nominations, in most, I can't say all cases, but at least all the hearings I've watched, and there have been quite a few over the last 39 years of my professional career and another 3 in law school, I can only remember 1 or 2 instances when a nominee has been questioned in the Senate or before the Judiciary Committee when asked about what kind of a stand they're going to take on an issue that either is before the court or the court has expressed an interest in accepting the case or likely will come, they will decline to answer it. Obviously, the politicians are asking the litmus test questions. The wiser, and I would say most of them, doesn't matter who's nominating and what their political philosophy is, but they have declined to answer those questions for that very reason.
Okay. Well, while I have the floor, let me simply state for the record that I, in general, agree with the HPC, and having an enclosed front porch myself, I don't think it makes that huge a difference in this particular case. I have no qualms about leaving it or restoring it back to the original. I think it could easily be restored back to the original. When I look at the house from the front on, I can see most of the integrity of the building. Windows can be changed back. That's not to me, that's not a significant reason to say that the integrity is not there. So I support the HPC on this one. Thank you.
Eric.
I have one more question, Mr. Simon. If I were to recuse myself, would that in turn make the supermajority 4 out of 6, or would it have to be 5 out of 6?
Have to do the math.
I know Mr. Thies's opinion, but
Yeah, I'm going to have a point of order on that.
It would have to be, if you take 66 and multiply .666 times 6, you end up with needed 4 votes.
Okay.
So I have a point of order on that.
Okay.
It's not a conflict of interest that Mr. Jacobson has declared, and that's the only basis for lowering the 100%.
I can, yeah.
No, but the ordinance is not that, to be honest, is not that clear. If he abstains, if Alderperson Jacobson abstains for a conflict of interest. 194. Section Roman numeral 12, 5.1a says if a protest is timely filed, goes on to say a minimum of 2/3 of the alderperson then holding office, excepting those who abstain for reasons of proclaimed conflict of interest, the number would be 5.
So I don't have a conflict of interest. Okay.
Diane.
Just point of order. Where are we in discussion? We haven't had a second
I've
to a
asked
motion.
if there would be a
so-
motion, and Dennis made a motion, but no one seconded it, so. we really should not be discussing it without a motion at this point.
Yeah. So I guess I'll have to reintroduce the fact that I'd like to make a motion to approve the historic landmark nomination, and I'm hoping somebody could say yes. That
I
they
will
would second.
bite the bullet and second it.
Okay, there's a motion by Roberts, seconded by Jacobson. Is there any other discussion? Bill?
Yeah, I'd first like to thank the Historic Preservation Commission for giving this a lot of time and thoughtful consideration, and it's been an education for me as far as what's considered historic on these houses. I went by the house several times and noticed the scrolling and everything. I gained a much greater appreciation for the house. There was some comparisons to the Ricker House as far as maintaining, as how you compare integrity and rebuilding of the porch and that. I remember looking at the Ricker House in the early 90s, I think when the garage with the carriage house was still there. So I think, according to one of the documents, said that was torn down in 93. So I think it was up for auction, if I remember right, and they didn't get their minimum bid, and then eventually PACA bought it for $100-some thousand with a loan that they'd gotten by an anonymous, somebody loaned them anonymously some money to buy it. Then they raised a lot of money with private donations, had a lot of volunteer help to fix it up, and then rebuilt the porch. And then after rebuilding the porch, redoing the siding, redoing the roof, it was nominated and accepted for historic landmarking. So it definitely had that integrity, I think, when it was accepted for landmarking. So I think there's two issues for me. One is the, historic significance, how you define that, and the other is the integrity. I think they're not opponents. They're the lawyers for the owners mentioned that brought up the argument of more of a natural language understanding of these words. I don't know when the ordinance was written if they had these definitions from various historic preservation societies on what integrity should mean, or if they meant it just commonly what we would understand when we read it today, or the Webster Dictionary definition. And integrity, when you are talking about an object, is basically wholeness. I disagree with the supposition the same person made that it has to be in excellent condition to have a high degree of integrity. I think it can be in various states of condition, but it has to be whole. And I think by enclosing the porch and removing the porch, it's not there anymore. There's no pillars, there's no bricks, pillars, or the bricks pillars that the pillars were on, whatever those are called. All that's gone. They rebuilt a foundation, they enclosed the porch. And I don't know if the original windows or doors behind the front of the porch are still there, but that would be part of the integrity too. And as the nominator pointed out, the porch makes up about half of the front of the first floor on the main facing side. So for me, I don't think it has. I don't think it maintains its integrity, which is one of the requirements. It's a present tense. I think Scott Dossett pointed that out during the meeting, that it should maintain its integrity, not possibly be able to be brought back to a wholeness and have its integrity back. And I think that was done on purpose too. I think it's something that if you nominate and landmark things that potentially could be brought back to their wholeness, and they never are, then they look bad. They never fulfill the goals of the nomination. I mean, I can't imagine putting up a landmark plaque in front of the house the way it is now, even if it's painted and, and spruced up a little bit. I think you'd want to have to require the porch to be rebuilt, and if the owner isn't willing to do that, you can't make them. I mean, I think if this had been nominated by the owner, if it was supported by the owner, if a private individual had bought it and said, yeah, I want to fix up the porch, I think that would be a great nomination. It'd be a great landmark. It'd be a real asset to the neighborhood. As far as the voting in the Historic Preservation Commission goes, so it passed with the bare minimum votes, 4 out of 6, 3 wouldn't have worked. But one of the members said that he didn't agree that it qualified under under qualification A, which was the historic significance. He said that he only thought it qualified under its the architectural, that it, yeah, under C, with the architecture and maintain the high degree of integrity. But the first sentence in this introduction that we have on how to evaluate integrity, historic integrity of a property, says integrity is the ability of a property to convey its significance. So if you can't agree that it's significant, how can it have any historic integrity? So depending on which definition of integrity you use, I don't see how you can justify it either way. It's either got to be whole, or it's got to have the ability of a property to convey its significance. And if you don't think it's significant, then it can't be. It can't qualify under C. So in that case, only 3 out of the 6 would actually have. It's not a strong enough argument, in my opinion, to make it a landmark. And finally, and then I'll be quiet. I just mentioned that other people. We're lucky to have a lot of people in town that have put a lot of money and work into historic houses and not really expect to get a great return out of it. I know the Baxleys have done that. Trent Shepard has done that. And some of them have also torn down houses that just weren't possible to bring back economically. So there, things work out both ways. I know there are a lot of nice properties that the owner of this property has done. I think 712 and 714 Green are some of his. Every time I go by there, I can't really tell whether they were original or whether they're new because they just blend in so well. So yeah, I'll just be brief and say I'm going to vote no.
Diane.
Well, I'm going to preface my comments with my little personal history with this case. When I got wind that this nomination was in the works, I decided I would go back as far as I could into the record based on my memory of how painful the last 2 historic designation nominations were for me personally. And I was hoping if I knew everything there was to know about this case, it would be a whole lot easier. Actually, this has turned out to be the most painful of all so far. Anyway, I watched the entire meeting of the MOR Development Review Board on September 30th. I attended in person both sessions of the HPC hearing for this case on January 6th and the 20th. Of course, read the staff memo, the nomination application, reviewed the 200-plus page memorandum of opposition from Mr. Thies, but I won't say that I read the entire thing. I also reviewed our historic preservation ordinance, and I've walked around this house several times, the most recent being this morning. So where I stand on this is I think this house has a history, but it doesn't qualify for landmark status. It does not meet the criteria laid out in our ordinance, in my opinion. 2 members of the Historic Preservation Commission voted against the landmark designation, and they gave very thoughtful reasons for it. City staff memo also was very clear in its analysis of the property. It's clear that the purpose of this landmark application is to prevent demolition of a house on Elm Street. It is not to celebrate its particular architectural or historical importance to the city of Urbana. And much of the discussion at all the meetings centered on things that weren't specifically relevant to the property itself, which is what we're supposed to be making these decisions on. We heard, and I appreciate the time and effort and passion that went into this on everyone's efforts. But we heard a lot about the neighborhood context, about the history of Urbana, about the possible people who lived in this house, about the interior of the house, which we can't take into account. You can gut the interior of a landmark home and still not jeopardize its landmark status. So in order to give a framework for us to make a decision, we have to focus on the criteria that we've been given. During the course of this discussion, it became clear to me that we need to revisit our landmark ordinance and our entire process, particularly when it comes to landmarking properties over owners' objections. I don't want to go through this process again. I don't think anybody should go through this process again. And I think we need to clarify some of the language, define the terms that everyone is using, but no one seems to know what they mean, or everyone has their own interpretation. I believe one of the attorneys, the expert in, one of the expert witnesses suggested having a continuum or, have a threshold. Try to define a threshold at which point a house meets the criteria or not, so we don't have to sit here guessing. And for that matter, it's probably time to evaluate the entire MOR concept. That district hasn't met its goals, but that's a whole nother issue. So I was going to replay a section of the testimony that was given by Mr. Fell at one of the hearings. If there's time, I might still do that tonight because it was extremely compelling for me. But anyway, this house has a history, but I do not believe it qualifies as historic landmark. It doesn't meet the criteria set out in the ordinance, and I won't support this ordinance.
Mr. Madigan.
I just want to say that I substantially agree with Bill and Diane's comments, so I won't be redundant with regard to those. But what I will say in addition to that is, to paraphrase someone much wiser than me about property rights. Property is not merely about ownership or possession, but it is in the unrestricted right of use, enjoyment, and disposal of that property. Anything which destroys any of these elements destroys property itself. And I think that's very instructive, and we ought to all remember that when we're considering what we do as a government to people's property rights. Now, do neighbors have property rights? Of course. Of course they do. Do they have the right to enjoy their property and not be impeded by the neighboring property? Yes. But in this instance, I think the property owner has demonstrated that this is within the context of the neighborhood and the city's vision, and I oppose this.
Aaron?
So let me say also that I have spent, I don't know, it's probably not as much time as some of my other colleagues, but I've listened to TED Talks and all kind of stuff about historic preservation and tried to understand something that actually I teased Dennis about quite a bit about historic preservation, because I don't know if I fully understood the importance of it until recently, and started to understand and think about the character of Urbana and talking to many members who've lived here and citizens who've lived here a long time. And so my eyes have been opened substantially as it relates to the character of older buildings and structures and maintaining the feel that we have in Urbana. And so I have tried, I was going to confess in my heart, to try my best to support this. But I find it very difficult to do so in the parameters in which I have been told that I need to operate within. And I look at some things about the house, and when I look at this original picture, I really do find it to be something that I could see as historic because of the different aspects of the home. But the changes that have been made, from the stairs on the side to a window being turned into a door, the porch being enclosed, there's just some significant changes, I do think, that change the character of it. And it would be difficult for me. I cannot support it as a historic site at this particular point. I've tried to see how I could do that, but I cannot. But I am concerned about something. And this is something that Mr. Newman or somebody else pointed out about living in a fishbowl. And I'm very concerned about, and I'm hoping that whatever happens to this property, that it does not turn into something where you have college students drinking, peering over into somebody else's backyard, doing whatever type of things. And if there's going to be some sort of break in the property line? Will there trees be maintained in the back to protect the privacy and of the other homes in the areas? And the scale, I'm skeptical of what that would look like, and if there are going to be some other plans to turn the other properties that you own into something similar and change the integrity of the area. So I am concerned about all those things, but I feel confined tonight that whatever vote you make, it's final, actually. But I just cannot. I've tried. I cannot support this as a historic site.
Eric.
So, it's pretty clear how this is going to go, but I am going to vote along the lines that I previously indicated I was leaning. But I do want to say a couple of things about historic and architectural significance. The characteristic of the Dutch Revival style is the roof line. That's what really makes it distinctive, characteristic, and there is no other, there's nothing else like it. It also, I'm really concerned about what seems to be a contradiction between the Moore District, between the language in the Moore District and says it's intended to promote the conservation of buildings and neighborhoods, which in combination or individually are of unique community and neighborhood significance. And yet, you know, conservation definitely implies not demolishing. There's a really interesting historic relationship that I'm going to bring up, but others may decide it's not significant, between the Ricker House and this house. The Ricker House was built right at the end of the Gilded Age, 1892. All of that stuff was a representation of the exuberance of that period. Then came the financial crash of 1893, which even I am not quite old enough to remember, but it was actually the worst financial crash until the Depression. It was the worst in the history of the United States until that time. And the Dutch Revival style emerged after that crash because it was more restrained. And so these two houses together actually tell a really important historical story. Now, maybe based on our ordinances, that's not relevant. But I find it to be very relevant, and I think that we ought to, when we look again, as maybe we should, at historical, historical preservation, landmark status, historic districts, and something like the Moore District, let's try to be a little bit more, we need to be perhaps both more clear, but also more comprehensive, and consider more the context of what we're about. I think we are going to lose. I mean, I see, I'm not a really high-powered politician, but I know how to count votes when people say right in front of me where they're going. So I think we're going to lose something really. I think we're going to lose something significant by that pair, by not having that pair of houses immediately next to each other. But let's look at how we define landmark status, historic district, districts that we want to do something in, and let's make it as clear as possible what we want to do.
Dennis.
You probably are going to guess that my interest is very strongly for the historic preservation of the community. I was the one who first proposed demolition delay as part of the historic preservation ordinance many years ago. Why? because we were finding that beautiful houses in the community, some of them are, yes, more significant perhaps than this rather humble home that we're looking at today, were suddenly facing demolition. And people had no concept that this was about to happen. These decisions were being made at the staff level. We were not aware that we were about to lose significant homes in our community. We've lost so many homes on the Elm Street corridor from demolition, including the wonderful Busey Mansion and its beautiful forest around it, of which today we have a 4-story apartment building, the Oaks, whatever it is, on Green Street. The Buseys were some of the founding members of this community, endowed the library, served the community on many different civic and religious boards, and that house is gone. The Cohen House used to be on Elm Street. It's been dragged over to East Green Street. The top floor was torn off because it wouldn't go under the wires that were there, and they couldn't afford to lift the wires, and so it's got a restructured roof line that's not appropriate anymore. At least they saved the house by moving it. Brian himself lived on Elm Street and was able to reconstruct his porch to an authentic, original design, which they found out actually later, after the architect helped them, that it actually was a recreation of the original porch when one of the original owners of the home's daughter or granddaughter came by with photographs of how the house used to look at the turn of the century. That porch had enclosures which were removed because that was an aesthetic recreation of the style. We've had the Bills House saved by historic nomination. That house has been repurposed as a boarding house for international students. The Baxleys purchased the house from the previous owner who disagreed with the nomination. He was happy to sell the house to them at the price he set, and the house is now a student center on that street. The other two buildings on Elm Street are the Gus Freeman home, which was in disrepair, and now the owners, which is the apartment complex, have maintained it, have restored capitals on the building. They're actually improving the quality of the house. And the next one to it was the Sutton, the Royal Sutton. He was a brick owner, and he owned the brickyard in town, and he built his house of bricks. It's a unique house, and that was also saved and these were saved by the nominations at the threat of demolition. So to denigrate the process that allows us to try to save the most important historic contextual buildings in our community just because it's supposedly a last-minute attempt. It's really the only attempt because many of these demolitions were granted by staff without review of the community at all. And so it was the community's outrage that stimulated the votes that led to the city council members agreeing to save these buildings. Now, it may not be the case tonight, but I appreciate everybody's care, everybody's concern about these buildings. I do have a couple things to say. That I think that, yes, like Eric said, I think the ordinance needs review, clarification of definitions, clearance of ambiguities, so that we all know what we're doing and we feel confident and it's also transparent. That we try to support the people who come forward with their nominations. I think it's extremely demoralizing to have staff make a recommendation. In the past we've heard that the staff supported nominations, but in this case staff didn't support it and they recommended not to support it. Now, what are you going to do if you're the only person who's taken all the time, personal time, to prepare the nomination, which requires research and historic accuracy and a clear definition of style and the knowledge to do that? And then before you even get a chance to speak, staff is recommending not to accept your nomination. I think it's an egregious breach of public trust to make any recommendation at all. I think it'd be more important for staff to say what the conditions that you should be looking for are, what potential issues that you should be considering most carefully, but refrain from making an opinion in this case. Now, maybe if it was some other kind of case, like acquiring property in the city as an annexation, that's a kind of a different thing. But this is, you should not be informing the commissioners how to vote before they even heard anybody speak. I think that's just, needs to be reconsidered. It's just the process is really bad. And I think it needs to be reconsidered. All right. And then I also think that we should invent new forms of historic preservation in this community. If the bar is too high for us to pass individual houses, or we have to deal with individual houses, why don't we follow the example of, say, Indianapolis, where an entire neighborhood has been declared historic? Well, what are the qualifications for that? I don't know what their qualifications are, but it's obviously lighter than what we're dealing with tonight. Why not create historic neighborhoods? And maybe we're declaring them out of pride of place. We've just heard comments today about how West Urbana has so many wonderful homes and is one of the top 10 communities in the United States to live. So why isn't Urbana a historic neighborhood? Not at the same picky level that we're doing this particular house with, but just out of community pride. You know, they did pay for unique signage on the streets in West Urbana out of their own pockets. Why doesn't the city support that and say that you've earned the right to have your neighborhood, several streets, maybe entire blocks of the city, considered by respect a historic neighborhood, which would then suggest that any huge change that occurred or maybe deterioration would have to be looked at a little bit more carefully. And then we have these, the ability to offer, financial, rewards for those who follow suit, and honor that respect, like, eliminating repair permit costs. And then finally, I'd like to see the Historic Preservation Commission. I don't know how this is going to be possible, to evolve from being sort of like a one-by-one reactive body to a more progressive body, and I think the first way to do that would be to have the Historic Preservation Commission announce or define its own goals. What are its goals to see historic preservation succeed in Urbana, and not be this this difficult process where it's contested between individuals? What can we do to bridge and elevate the conversation to pride rather than all about, I want my top dollar for my property and I don't care about you folks? I'm not saying that's what we're having here, but it sounds like I've heard the word maximize your property value in the HPC meetings as presented by the plaintiff. Let's lift this up and see what we can do with this. So I really think that your participation and the fact that so many people came out today is really important. And yes, I could expect it to be a 50-50 thing. A lot of issues come down to 50-50%. But I encourage the community, and I encourage the HPC, and I encourage staff to improve, because right now City Council suffers with a very difficult and troublesome procedure. And that's my bit. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Ammons?
No.
Mr. Braun?
No.
Mr. Jacobson?
Yes.
Mr. Madigan?
No.
Ms. Marlin?
No.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Smythe? Mr. Smythe?
Charlie, are you there still?
He's a little older, he might have phoned it in.
Oh, there he is.
Charlie?
Charlie, time to vote.
I try. Yes.
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 Okay.
Okay. That motion fails. Thank you all very much. Okay, we'll move on to ordinance number 2016-02-008, an ordinance amending the zoning ordinance of the City of Urbana, Illinois, revising Article 2, Article 5, and Article 8 to establish definitions and use provisions for dwelling transitional home. And this comes from the Plan Commission. So who is going to talk about that? Looks like Lori's going to talk about it.
Okay.
Okay, Lori. It's always going to be contentious if you know somebody's property is. There's no way to avoid that. Because if they feel differently, you're taking something from them, you know? That's exactly right. Then it would be very smooth. Nobody would argue. Well, they might argue if it wasn't very historic, but, you know, it takes all the anxiety out. Are you ready? Okay, here we are with Lori, who is going to delve into this ordinance.
Yes, we are here this evening as a result of a resolution that was passed by council in November of 2015, requesting the zoning administrator to bring forward and go through the process, a text amendment to look at transitional homes, particularly to look at them, to allow them in additional areas than we currently would allow.
Could we get the room to be a little quieter,
People
please?
are leaving.
Yeah, maybe we could.
Yeah,
If-
we're
if-
on to the next agenda item, so if you want to have a conversation, could you please go out in the hall?
Thank you.
Okay.
The way that we have addressed this issue up to now is to call a transitional home a dwelling, home for adjustment. So I'll get into the differences between those in a moment, but in essence, and I think the resolution helped move us along to that, they're two different uses. They should be separate, and that's what I'm going to present today is how we have created a new use transitional home. So dwelling transitional home is the proposed new use. Typically, those are residential in nature, typically smaller. Residents live there anywhere between 6 months, 2 years. It helps really to fill the gap between emergency housing for a homeless shelter, for instance, and permanent housing. Services are often offered. Training to help people get back on their feet in order to live on their own again is typically what you'd see in a transitional home. The way we define a dwelling home for adjustment, on the other hand, is really a more intense use. It includes the homeless shelters, crisis centers, rehabilitation centers, halfway houses. Our definition does not include any limitations on the number of people that can be in these facilities, so they can be very intense uses. Now, to develop those regulations, we looked at some national studies, research from the American Planning Association, and we also looked to our own zoning ordinance because there is another somewhat similar use that could provide a model for how we should perhaps handle transitional homes. And that use is the community living facility. That has a very specific definition, so we can't group transitional homes as community living facilities because those were designed to serve, it's a residential use also, but it's really to serve people with either mental and or physical disabilities. So that is a completely separate use. However, the model, we can still use the model when we're looking at proposed regulations for transitional homes. So in essence, the community living facility is divided into 3 different categories depending on how many people live there. And so the transitional home categories that we are proposing here, there are 2 categories: transitional home category 1 for up to 4 residents and 1 live-in staff member. That is similar but not exact to community living facility category 1, which allows more staff presumably because of the service-dependent population there. Transitional home category 2, we are proposing to allow 8 residents plus 2 live-in staff, which is consistent with community living facility category 2. And so what I've shown here is a table that really helps to illustrate where the different uses are allowed in the different zoning districts and where the proposed transitional home 2 categories would be allowed. Home for adjustment, as I mentioned, could be a fairly intensive use, so generally those are permitted in the more intense zoning districts. Community living facilities, a less intense use, particularly those with the fewer number of people living there, so those are permitted in more categories, or more zoning districts, excuse me. We are proposing transitional home, the smallest one, the 4 residents plus 1 live-in staff, to be permitted in the R4 and higher residential districts and most of the business districts, to be a conditional use permit. And what that means is 1 public hearing at Zoning Board of Appeals, and that's where the final decision is made, to be a conditional use permit in the R2 and R3 zoning districts, as well as some of the business and MOR. For the larger transitional home, those with 8 residents plus 2 live-in staff, because there are more people living there, potentially more impacts, we are suggesting special use in many cases. For instance, in the R2 zone, the R3 zone, and a few others, and then stepping that down a bit to only require conditional use in R4, which is a multifamily zone. And just to remind you, a special use goes to Plan Commission as a public hearing and then to City Council for final approval. The Ps in this chart are permitted uses. Those are allowed as a matter of right. So what we're proposing here really is somewhere in between the home for adjustment, the more intense use, and the community living facility, which is the less intense use. We felt like the transitional home would fit somewhere in the middle, which is why we selected these particular zoning districts as our proposed changes. The other thing we needed to tackle with this text amendment is the parking requirement. Because this use is often similar to the community living facilities and the home for adjustment, we are suggesting grouping it into the same parking requirement, which is 1 for every employee on a maximum shift and 1 for every 4 non-employee residents. So what that means is for a category 1, that smallest home, it would require 2 parking spaces, and that is what we would require for a single family home anyway. The larger units, it really depends on the number of employees, but anywhere between 3 and 4 parking spaces could be required as part of this process. So that is a very quick summary of our suggested changes. Basically a new definition for a transitional home, breaking that down to 2 categories, a small and a larger one, allowing them in more zoning districts than currently allowed by our definition of home for adjustment. And what we are, City Council is charged to do is either approve the proposed amendment as presented, approve with suggested changes, deny the amendment. At the Urbana Plan Commission meeting, they unanimously recommended that City Council approve the text amendment, and staff concurs with that recommendation.
Diane.
Well, thank you for working on this. I intend to support this ordinance. I think the way it's written now is that it's fair to all neighborhoods, and there's consistency across the city. And if the public may recall that what got this whole discussion started was the proposal for a transitional home on North Matthews Street. And in order to make it work within our zoning ordinance, we were asked to both change the zoning from R2 single family to R4 multifamily, plus issue a special use permit. And it was like trying to fit a round peg into a square hole. We just didn't have the framework to accommodate that particular type of housing. This cleans all that up, and And I like the idea that it's split into 2 different levels. The up to 4 people is what we'd have in any home in Urbana. 4 unrelated people can live by right. But there's still some oversight at the Zoning Board of Appeals. It's a conditional use, so if there are particular, each case can be looked at individually, and if there are particular conditions that the neighborhood thinks are important to have, those can be considered. The higher level of up to 8 persons goes to the Plan Commission for review, and then ultimately to the City Council, which means there's the 2 levels of review, and again, we can attach whatever conditions we want. So I think this is a good solution, and again, it provides consistency across the city and really fairness to the neighbors, the neighborhood, as well as the people proposing.
Are you
projects.
making a motion?
Oh, yeah, yes, sorry. I'm going to move ordinance number 2016-02-008.
Second.
And I would also, Eric really should have moved it because he was the one who got this going at the
Well-
staff level. So thank you.
Well,
Okay.
I'll just maybe if I make a comment since I've already spoken to second it. I really appreciate what you've done, and it's exactly, I think, what we needed. And most importantly, there will be people's lives who will be turned around, who would otherwise just fall through the cracks. So I think it's a good job.
Dennis?
Yes, I'd like to thank Eric for spearheading this thoughtful change, which didn't occur to me how to solve it, but it occurred to him. And I think it's a very important change. I like very much the way you crafted it, having both provisional and conditional uses, and as some of the for some of the lower residence levels, R2 and R3. It's very thoughtful. It helps give a little bit of input from the community about the process, which I think they'll appreciate. I think it's a very wisely and well crafted amendment, so I'm going to support it.
Okay, we have, do you want to talk, Aaron?
Sure, just for a quick moment, because sounds like there's a lot of comments talking around something that's in my ward about, I appreciate the changes that have been made to the language that accommodated the concerns of some of my constituents around the zoning issues, spot zoning, and what could possibly occur if it were not rezoned and this language was not changed. So that kind of spearheaded, that got Eric and other folks involved. So I just wanted to make sure that we saw the complete context of this conversation before we took this vote. But thank you for the work that you did on it.
But
Eric?
But hopefully, this will create a situation, or help to create a situation, where these facilities can go in anybody's ward.
So, yes, it creates the context of that, but I'm under no illusion that this is going to show up in Behringer Commons or some other different places like that. And Mr. Madigan may agree or disagree, but if he wants to purchase one of those houses, and let's see if they put one in Behringer Commons, I would be thoroughly impressed. But we do appreciate the opportunity for individuals to have a chance to change their lives and stuff. But I look forward to that day, though, Mr. Madigan, that we have one of these in Behringer Commons.
We have plenty of lots out there if somebody wants to build one.
Okay.
Okay, we have a motion by Marlin, seconded by Jacobson. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Ammons?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Jacobson?
Yes.
Mr. Madigan?
Yes.
Ms. Marlin?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Smythe?
Yes.
That motion carries. Next, we have ordinance number 2016-02-009, an ordinance amending the zoning ordinance of the City of Urbana, Illinois, revising Article 2, Article 5, and Article 9 to change definitions, use provisions, and regulations for home occupations. Christopher Marks. Will explain this.
Good evening. I'll try to keep this as brief as possible without sacrificing any ability to provide information. So, obviously at the request of members of the council as well as staff observations over the last several years, it seems appropriate to make adjustments to home occupation and how it's regulated in the zoning ordinance. We don't really have to spend lots of time talking about the changing nature of the economy, the ways that people are working out of their homes, people are more enabled to work where they choose to, et cetera, as well as just observations of people that in this city have employed themselves in the places where they live. So after research of other municipalities as well as talking with business owners in the city who do business on a local, regional, but also, and in some cases, global nature, we came up with a few changes with a text amendment that we felt would work within the context of what already exists with existing levels of review, and that would be be more accommodating to potential home occupations without necessarily changing the ability of the zoning ordinance to properly do its job in that of regulating uses and intensity of uses within the city. So to quickly just review what currently exists, the home occupation ordinance, which I believe was added in the late 90s, which has seen minor adjustments but not too many, categorizes two different levels of home occupation with some restrictions, mostly differentiating the two with if a certificate of occupancy is needed or not. The first category, and a C of O, meaning certificate of occupancy, is required in the case that most distinctively if someone other than people residing in the household is working there or not. And even within in the category B, category A is a home occupation that is allowed without a certificate of occupancy, and then category B is where one is required because a person not residing in the household is employed in the home occupation. So that's the main distinction, and even then, that only one additional person not residing in the household is allowed to be employed there. So I'll basically mention the changes that we are proposing. We're proposing that the two categories, type A and type B, still exist, and we're proposing the creation of a type C category. And with those changes, it's changes to definitions, it's providing further clarification and description of those categories, and it's some changes to the regulation in Article 5 of the use regulations. And then just one minor change in Article 9 where signage is concerned. That's just for consistency for what was already mentioned in Article 5. So the three categories are type A, which is defined as a home occupation that has a minimal impact on the property and surrounding beyond the scope of the residential use, involving occupants in the subject dwelling and resulting only in incidental traffic associated with the occupation. Type B, which is still largely the same as existing, is one that's defined as a minor amount of traffic from individuals not residing in the household and exceeds the intensity in type A. The new category that we're creating is type C, and that's what's defined as it has an impact on the property beyond that associated with types A or B, and it has an increase in the number of employees or the number of daily visits, be it from customers or clients or deliveries associated with the home occupation. This sort of category would require a conditional use permit that would be approved by the Zoning Board of Appeals or not. And it would be subject to the same criteria, existing criteria as defined in the zoning ordinance that the Zoning Board of Appeals must take into consideration. To quickly go under the changes proposed for type A, one consistent theme, just quickly to mention, is that we've made proposed changes that are similar to changes that have already been made in moving away from the term members of the family just to members of the household, because of the more types of arrangements we have with living situations in this country and just in the city, as well as with college students and couples, et cetera. So Type A has language added that provides just better description, gives some examples of private consulting, non-retail-based arts and crafts studio, internet-based businesses, telecommunications-based businesses, people who might be telecommuting from their home, whatnot. It allows a slight increase in the signage of not just 1 square foot, but 3 square feet for a wall-mounted nameplate, so that it's the physical form of the sign is largely the same. It just allows a little bit greater visibility as well. It has just some added language to keep the exterior visibility of the household the same, so that there's no indication of any home occupation inside the dwelling. It also adds language that better describes it as being visible from a public right-of-way. There's a slight language added that includes trucks or trailers, along with the limit of 2 commercial or business vehicles, so accessories to trucks or trailers. And for category B, the description is just expanded a little bit, but the category is largely the same. Home occupations that may include music lessons, professional consultations, personal services such as clothing alterations or shoe repair. Requires approval from the zoning administrator, as well as the issuance of a certificate of occupancy. One area in which we tried to make more accommodations was the increasing from 1 person to 2 people who do not reside in the dwelling that can be allowed under the home occupation. Another major area in which we expanded upon this was defining customer visits, as well as parking associated with that. Currently, there's a requirement with a Type B that anyone who has a certificate of occupancy issued to them must have 2 available parking spaces, off-street parking spaces on the property. A driveway is allowed to fulfill that requirement, or it might be in their garage. But that description that requirement, I think, can vary in different neighborhoods in the city. The language that we're proposing for the Type B allows an adjustment to that, to where the zoning administrator may waive or reduce that requirement based upon expected demand that's generated, or a location of the home occupation, or the availability of existing on-street parking. Regarding customer-client visits, there's an establishment of 10 visits per day, be it from customers or clients, scheduled or not scheduled, and home deliveries as well, with no more than 3 present at any time. That's an increase from the amount of 2. We included language on daycare homes just to, that's language that's consistent with existing language within the zoning ordinance, and it's also mentioned just to remove the possibility that inspections from the state is not included as part of their count. The language about exterior visibility is the same. The language about the signage is also consistent with Type A, just an increase from 3 square feet from 1 square foot. And then just changes in the language of the household. There's also a condition a criteria that's added that says the zoning administrator shall identify and impose other conditions on the home occupations as determined by the specifics of the application in order to meet the intentions of the ordinance and to protect the general welfare of the city. For Type C home occupations, this is the type that allows for the special exemption exception to the rule of most of the home occupations that I talked with were people who were, 1 or 2 people or a married couple that worked out of their home. They had that under these proposed changes that they would have qualified for a Type A or Type B. There are very few situations where a Type C would realistically come into question. That said, though, this is a category that allows a unique, more intensive use of home occupation to occur, but it also allows a proper vetting and public hearing, review, and information to the surrounding neighborhoods. All the procedures that happen with a conditional use permit, it allows that to still occur to, I think, allow the zoning ordinance to still do its job in that sense. So some of the examples include light assembly and packaging for internet sales, on-site sales of limited goods and services, greenhouses or plant sales, bicycle repairs or sales, minor home auto repairs, etc. Another change that was made was we eliminated the restriction that only one home occupation was allowed per home, so that allows a married couple where either both of the spouses might have different jobs or different home-based occupations. This allows, as long as it's still within the confines of how many people residing there, working there, or the restrictions in Type A or Type B or Type C, that's they're allowed to do that. Or someone who might have multiple businesses, but they're still a one-man show. We also removed the requirement of on-site growth of vegetation, things used for greenhouses or plant sales. And we also eliminated the requirement, or proposed eliminating the requirement of 200 square feet for storage of materials. That's just because if it's being stored on the inside, it's not changing too much of the surrounding neighborhood as well. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the changes to Article 9 are just for consistency with what's proposed for changes in the nameplates. This ordinance still keeps home occupations as an accessory use to the dwelling in a residential neighborhood. A question that might be posed is why it's still requiring for Type A the submission of an application and the review or approval by the zoning administrator. That's done for just to allow proper, I think, tracking and of home occupations, and to allow just to make sure that a proper review is going in place to make sure that a Type A that really should be a Type B is still going into place. So for that reason, we've still kept that aspect in the ordinance, but it shouldn't be too burdensome for any applicants. So with that said, are there any questions that you have for me?
Dennis.
Yeah, thanks. I'm sure that a lot of these improvements will help people who are now finding new ways to aid to their income by working in their homes. Just had a couple of questions about it. Maybe because some things seemed a little general, and I just wanted to get a clear idea. So I'm looking at the Type A selection. And number 5 is, the new number 5 is no more than 2 commercial or business vehicles, trucks or trailers used, etc. That's, well, these pages are not numbered, but, so, yes. So I wanted to, so the word trailers strikes me. I can picture what a truck looks like, but I think that there's many kinds of trailers, and I'm just wondering what we allow to have now parked in residential areas which might be a trailer. Because I'm thinking of a gentleman that works nearby who mows lawns, and he has a trailer on the back of his truck on which he loads and unloads very large lawn cutting machines. So will he be able to park his trailer just like in front of his house? And what will people think down the block?
Well, you'd still be required to have the proper, we have language in the ordinance that already mandates how recreational vehicles or accessories to cars have to be parked. So it would still be subject to the same requirements of that, being respecting the proper setbacks or the approved the surface that it has to be parked on. So.
So you were saying that this trailer would have to be parked in a driveway, as opposed to being on the city street?
That's correct.
So it would have to be in a driveway.
If it's associated with a home occupation or business.
Okay. All right. I want to ask then about home occupations. Maybe this, I wrote this down on number B, and my question was, okay, we have the types of home occupations in type B include, or but not limited to, music lessons, professional consultations, personal services, clothing alterations, and shoe repair. What about food, cooking in a kitchen for distribution, say at the farmer's market or whatever, or keeping a curbside food truck parked at the house?
Well,
I ask this because I also know where one is parked in my area.
Well, if it's cooking for something that's prepared at the market, it's type B is based off of how many visits, back and forth will be happening between any customers or clients or employees.
Okay, so this would probably be none for this instance. So, but if you were going to maintain a mobile food cart, where would you be able to put it? Not in a residential area?
That's correct.
It would have to be next to your business.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And it would not be a business in the home?
I'm sorry?
It would not be a business in the home? Yeah.
I think that we should look at this particular case because...
Case by case?
No, your suggestion that there's a food truck parked, food truck is a mobile business. When it's parked in the public street, it must comply with our parking regulations. So we're talking about businesses that are taking place in the home. So I think, is that food truck operating out of the home or the truck? And we have other regulations for food trucks. Not through the zoning ordinance, but we're pretty permissive with them, but you do need to work with the finance department to get licenses and permits, and then there's procedures about where they can be parked during business. But
this
many individuals work outside the home, but they would drive their business vehicles just because that's the nature of the business. They have they're a plumber. And, they may not be operating out of the home. They might have an office, but yet they might have their vehicle that is parked at their home.
Right, I get that. My brother's an electrician, and he parks his truck in his driveway. Yes. All right. Just checking. And then I want to ask about minor home auto repair. Do we allow people to work on cars as a source of income in their driveways? I kind of thought we didn't, but it sounds like this, as well as bicycle repair, will be seen now at the homes.
It's allowed within, as far as zoning is concerned, it's allowed as, we did add language to specify that it was only minor automobile repairs. Major automobile repairs, such as performing commercial, for services, oil changes, are not allowed, but
well, I pictured major as being like working on brakes, but minor would be tuning up people's cars, doing oil changes. These are minor repairs.
Oil changes aren't allowed because you're required to have building safety has specific requirements to.
Right, but people would be, perhaps the hood would be up and you'd be leaning over tuning up somebody's car, right? In your driveway.
Yes.
Which I thought is something we really like to avoid. So I'm just wondering. Yes, go ahead. Somebody clarify.
Oh, I would just say that we do allow that currently, but it is very restrictive, and probably of all the home occupations, that's one that we would get most of the complaints. So that's why we limit the number of cars, the placement of the cars, and what the actual repairs can be.
Great. Okay, because that's a concern. So in correlation with that, if you're going to do repairs at home and they're automotive, should we be requiring that they do this in their garage, or that there be a garage in which it is done, or do we do that already?
It is it does exist already in letter E.
Okay.
Any vehicle to be repaired may not queue outside the garage. Any vehicles are repaired inside a garage, and no inoperable vehicles are stored outside.
Great, okay. I didn't read that because it wasn't underlined, but thank you for clarifying. And now the last thing, section 9, that's IX-4, talking about signs. You talk about flags, no more than 2 flags on a premise. What about banners? You know, it's like people have, we've had things where people have left up, you know, opening banners, you know, new business, you know, hello, and they put a banner up and it lasts for 6 months.
Yeah, there aren't any existing changes. These are, I only listed those to list the progression to item number 4. There aren't any changes being, that's language that applies to commercial areas. That sort of signage would mostly not be allowed in a residential area. The only change for signage in a residential area would just be for the home occupation, and even then it's still restricted to a mounted wall nameplate, no bigger than 3 feet.
Okay, so we're not talking about the other 3 don't really apply to these categories.
No,
anyway.
I can, and you weren't the first. Charlie asked me about that as well, and I clarified that for him. So
okay,
didn't mean to be confusing, but
that's my questions. Thank you,
Diane.
So if I was a piano teacher in my home, I would need to get I would need to fill out an application for a home-based business and get a certificate of occupancy. Is that right?
depending on how many people you had coming to visit during the day. If you had more than 5 vehicle visits per day, then yes. If you had less than that, then no.
And do people pay a fee for any of this?
No. Only for a certificate of occupancy, which it requires an inspection from our building safety division.
So it's just
If that-
paperwork. The paperwork is what they do.
Well, currently the type A is $0. I think.
That's correct. Type B
is $50.
but that's for the certificate of occupancy.
Right.
So we do charge. For a person to give piano lessons, we charge.
If they're having more than 5 people per day visit, or if they have another person employed.
Well, that wouldn't be a piano. Okay.
Well, I'm just saying technically.
It's 5 vehicles. You could have kids walking there, and it wouldn't count toward the total count of 5 vehicles per day.
Or you could define that as customer client. In the current language, it says. Let's say that. 5. It says, yeah, that's true, but it says vehicle visits is how it's defined in existing language.
Oh, Eric.
So one of the motivations for talking about this and revisiting this was neutral cycle in my neighborhood. And just thinking about the fact that they are so unconventional, they're likely to figure out, not on purpose, but just because of the way they are, some way not to quite fit. So is there a provision, like as in other zoning, for applying for variances?
Well, I think one of the main reasons we undertook this is to allow those situations that need that review. They would now be able to obtain a conditional use if they were determined to be a type C. Currently, you don't have that opportunity, so we've added a whole other category that opens up a world of home occupations that can be reviewed that go beyond kind of the narrow constraints of the type A and B that we have now.
On a case-by-case basis. Yeah. Okay, great.
Okay, is there a motion?
I'll move to approve this.
Second.
Motion by Roberts, seconded by Ammons. Any other discussion? Mr. Madigan.
So just a couple of quick questions. So, well, yeah, the pages aren't numbered, so
They should be. Apologies.
What's that?
I said they should be.
It's okay. No. So I'm looking at customer and client visits under, I guess it's B. Talk about a daycare. Homes should be allowed a total of up to 5 children or dependent adults to be cared for on the premises at any time. Does that track with state law?
Yeah, it's consistent with our definitions in the zoning ordinance for daycare home and for the larger daycare classification.
Would it make more sense there just to reference what's allowable by state law to keep that more?
Try to avoid outside references in the zoning ordinance in case they change, but it is consistent. That's where the numbers came from.
So if the state law becomes more restrictive or more expansive based upon what
we
the
would
General
need to
Assembly and the
amend-
governor does.
Yeah, we would then want to amend this because we do want to be consistent, so.
Right, which would bolster my argument for referencing whatever the state law is. But you just avoid that entirely?
We don't have that many outside references. I don't know that it would hurt to add a reference. I just don't have the section handy.
I don't feel strongly about it. It just seemed to me to be something that would not have to go through the process to be amended if the state, if a higher authority just decides that there ought to be a different standard. Not that big a deal. My other question, I think it was answered, but I just want to revisit it really quickly. A little lower on the same page, we talk about vehicle storage. Dennis asked about trailers. I had the same question in this section. No exterior storage of vehicles other than those owned by members of the household residing on the premises. Would that include, would vehicles there include, say, a cargo trailer that's incidental incidental to the business? Say a small cargo trailer?
Yes, that would include such incidental or accessory to main vehicles, yeah.
Okay, so if somebody had, like Dennis said, his brother has a van, maybe it doesn't fit in the garage, or maybe somebody's got a truck that pulls a trailer, doesn't fit in the garage, it can be in the driveway.
Yeah.
Okay, that's all I had.
I have a question. Is this pretty close to what other communities in Illinois have already, or are we cutting edge here?
We did look at other communities, and some have more, comparable size and situations, at Bloomington Normal or Peoria and Evanston. Some of them we found had more restrictive policies on home occupations, or they had much greater, much more descriptive definitions, they were, I think, in a much different form than what we have existing already. And just in talking with, based on the interviews that I had with some of the home-based businesses, that were very involved with the community, with the UBA, with and had, with their customer clientele, with the market, that they were cautious about any drastic change from the city or policy, as well as the different neighborhoods that have different concerns and ideas about what they would want to see their neighbor doing, what they wouldn't. And we decided that it was the best policy to bend but not break of what we already have, and
Okay.
to.
Thank you.
I do think it's progressive, though. The new conditional use is progressive for us, so.
Did you,
One
Mike
quick-
Madigan?
One quick final question. I know we're bumping up against the hour.
3 minutes.
How does this compare to Champaign?
Champaign does not have as much description in their ordinance as Urbana does. It allows some uses, but it's significantly less descriptive than our existing ordinances. So.
Okay. We have a motion by Roberts, seconded by Ammons. Is that correct? Would the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Ammons?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Jacobson?
Yes.
Mr. Madigan?
Yes.
Ms. Marlin?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Smythe?
Yes.
That motion carries. And there being no further business, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Good night, Charlie.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, Charlie.